Hey there, and welcome back. Let the day loosen its hold on you now, settle where you are, wherever that is, and let your shoulders come down from wherever the hours have been keeping them. This is a slow evening, the kind made for a long life, told from one end to the other, told without hurry, for anyone who likes to be carried gently, backward through time, until the present lets go its grip. I would like to take you a long way tonight, across the narrow sea and back through 800 years and more, to a low green country of rivers and cloth towns, and to a girl born there who did not yet know that a kingdom was waiting for her. You need do nothing at all but lie still and let the years come to you, one after another, the way the tide comes in over flat sand. And when you are ready, we will go back together to a winter when a fine new ship went down in the black water off a Norman shore, and to a girl in Brabant who had never heard of it, and who would be Queen of England because of it. Before we begin, a small and easy thing. If the slow telling of a whole life is something you would like to find your way back to on other nights like this one, you are welcome to stay and welcome to subscribe. And these quiet histories will come to you again whenever you want them. I look through the old chronicles and the old letters and pull out the lives that make good company in the small hours, and I lay them out slowly, in order, the way I am about to lay out this one. There is nothing you need to do about any of it tonight. Only let me know, in your own time, if these evenings are the kind of thing you would like to keep. That is all. Now let it go, and come with me. Picture this. A low country of water and green, spread flat beneath a wide northern sky, laced through with slow rivers and dyke and willow, and dotted with towns grown fat and busy on wool and weaving. This is Brabant, in the old duchy of Lower Lotharingia, in the years just after the 1100s began. The land does not roll and pitch as it does in the south. It lies open and patient, given over to water meadows and to the looms that clatter behind the shutters of the cloth towns, from first light until the bell for vespers. Along the river, Digel sits the town of Louvain, and above the town, on a shoulder of rising ground, stands the hall of its count. It is here, in or around 1103, that a daughter is born to Godfrey, Count of Louvain, and it is with her that we will spend this whole evening, from her first seasons in this watered country to her last, far away and long hence. Louvain in those days was a town of the middling sort, neither small nor among the very greatest, but busy and growing, gathered along the banks of the Digel, where the river could turn a mill and float a barge. Its life was the life of the water and the wool, the barges coming up laden and going down again with cloth, the mills grinding, the market filling on its day with the produce of the flat rich country round about. Grain and cheese and cattle, and the fine woven stuff that was the country's pride. Above the roofs stood the church, the tall stone house of God, where the townsfolk were christened and married and buried, and where the great feasts of the year were kept with candle and procession. And above the town on its rise stood the seat of the Count, from which the whole small world was watched and ruled and taxed and kept. This was the world Adeliza's eyes first opened on, and though she would leave it young and see far grander places, it is the ground her earliest self was made of. The flat horizons and the wide skies, the smell of the river and the wet fields, the clatter of the looms and the church bells over the roofs, the coming and going of merchants speaking a dozen tongues of trade, all of it soaked into her before she had words for any of it. And it is worth setting the scene with some care, because it is nearly all we have of her beginnings. The records do not give us her childhood in any detail. No anecdote, no saying, no remembered scene. They give us only the place and the family and the year, and leave us to furnish the rest from what such a childhood was. So we furnish it gently and set the small girl down beside her father's river, and let her grow there a while in the mind before the wide world comes for her. They called her Adeliza. In her own country the name took other shapes on other tongues, Adelaide and Aladis and plain Adela. The way names shifted before they were fixed by writing. But Adeliza is the form that would follow her across the sea into the chronicles of England. And so it is the one we will keep tonight. Her father Godfrey was a man on the rise, and men on the rise cast a long reach with their daughters. He held Louvain and Brussels and the broad rich lands about them, and before Adeliza's childhood was out, he would be lifted higher still, made Duke of Lower Lotharingia, one of the border princes of the Western Empire, a lord whose loyalty the emperor courted, and whose banner other lords watched to see which way it leaned. Her mother, by the best account that survives, was a lady named Ida, thought to be of the house of Chinny, though the records of women in this age are worn thin, and much of what a daughter would have known of her mother has simply not come down to us across the centuries. What has come down instead is a reputation, carried forward through the later chronicles, that Adeliza grew into a young woman of an unusual and much remarked beauty. The fair maid of Brabant, they would name her afterward, when it mattered to remember why a king had wanted her. We should hold that lightly, for beauty in a chronicle is often only a way of saying a match was thought fortunate, but it clung to her, and it is worth carrying with us. Set the crown aside for now, though, and think only of the child in that hall by the river. She grew up inside the household of a great lord, and such a household was a whole small world in itself. Bounded by the great hall and the chapel and the women's chambers, turning to the round of the church year and the ceaseless business of a ruling house. The hall would have been a place of long trestle tables and rushes strewn on the floor of wood smoke, finding its way up to the blackened roof beams, of hounds asleep by the hearth and messengers coming in mud spattered off the winter roads with letters sealed in wax. She would have grasped early the shape of her father's importance, watching the men who came to treat with him, hearing the names of far places spoken at table as though they lay just over the next low hill. She would have learned her prayers at her mother's knee, and the handling of a needle, and something of her letters too, for she grew into a woman who prized books and the making of them. And that kind of taste is planted young, or it is not planted at all. And above everything else she would have absorbed the one thing every daughter of such a house came to know before she knew anything more, which was that she did not belong entirely to herself. A daughter of a rising prince was a thread in the weaving of policy. She would be spent one day on an alliance, and the only open matter was where, and to whom, and how far from home. What did such an upbringing actually give a girl like Adeliza in those years by the river? It gave her, first of all, the running of a household, for a great lady was above everything the mistress of a large and complicated establishment, and the skills of it were taught young. She would have been shown how a hall was provisioned and a store managed, how servants were ordered and kept, how the endless round of a noble house was made to turn smoothly through the seasons, when to be open-handed and when to be careful. She would have been drilled to keep account of what came in and what went out, for a mistress who could not reckon was soon cheated. These were not small accomplishments, and they were the true trade of a woman of her rank, more useful to her by far than any music or fine needle, though she would have those too. She would have learned her faith deeply, not as a matter of a few prayers, but as the whole frame of her days, the saints and their feasts, the meaning of the Mass, the shape of the Church's year, the works of mercy that a noble woman owed to the poor at her gate. She would have been trained to carry herself, to sit and to speak, and to move as befitted her birth, to receive a guest and to preside at a table, and to hold her own dignity among proud people. And she would have picked up languages most likely, the Latin of the Church at least a little, and perhaps something of the French that was the speech of courts across the Western world. So that when the day came to cross into a French-speaking court, she was not wholly without a tongue. All of this was the quiet preparing of a girl for the one great use that her house would make of her, and Adeliza was prepared well. When the summons came from England, it found a young woman ready, by her whole upbringing, to be a queen, whatever the fear in her heart, as she made ready to go. For the Low Countries were rich, and rich lands draw the notice of the powerful. Brabant lay squarely across the trade of half of Europe. Its cloth went everywhere, the roads and the rivers ran, and everywhere the cloth went, the coin and the consequence of its makers followed after, from the great fairs of Champagne to the counting houses of the Italian towns. A count who could place a well-married daughter into a distant court extended his reach 100 miles and more without ever drawing a sword. Godfrey understood this as all such men understood it, in his very bones. And so, through all the green years of Adeliza's girlhood, while she learned the psalms and watched the flat-bottomed barges come up, the dyed laden with raw wool for the looms, there was always, somewhere above her head and well out of her hearing, the slow patient reckoning of what she might one day be worth, and to whom she might be given. She did not know, in those watered years, that the answer would arrive from across the sea, from a kingdom she had likely never thought hard about for the space of a single afternoon, and that it would come to her out of a grief she had no part in, and could never have foreseen. But that is the way these things arrived in that age, unlooked for, on a fast horse. We will leave her here a while, safe in Louvain, a girl of good birth in a prosperous country, and turn our eyes westward to the sea, and across it, to the island where her whole life was already being shaped by hands she would never touch. That is exactly where we are going next, for to understand why Adeliza of Louvain would be lifted clean out of Brabant and set upon a throne, we must first understand the kingdom that would send for her, and the king who would want her, and the wound in his house that only she was thought able to heal. And so we cross the water now, westward, into England. To a girl in Brabant, England was a rumour long before it was ever a place. It lay out beyond the edge of the ordinary roads, across a strip of grey and treacherous water. A kingdom that merchants spoke of, and pilgrims passed through, and very few of her own countrymen had ever actually set eyes upon. What was known of it on the continent came in fragments, carried home by wool buyers and travelling churchmen, and the occasional returning pilgrim, and the fragments came to roughly this: that England was ruled by a hard and clever king named Henry, that this Henry was the youngest son of the man they still called, with a kind of awe, the Conqueror. The Duke of Normandy, who had taken the whole island by battle a single generation before, in the year every soul in that world could name without pausing to think, 66 of the century just past. That the Conqueror's blood now sat upon two seats at once, the crown of England and the ducal chair of Normandy, and that this youngest son held them both together in one hand, and held them with a grip that never once slackened in more than 30 years. And England was not, for a daughter of the Low Countries, quite so strange and so far a place as all that grey water between might suggest. For between Flanders and Brabant on the one shore and England upon the other, there ran already an old and a strong thread of trade, and the thread was made of wool. The looms of her own country fed above all upon English wool. The long fine fleeces of the English sheep that were carried across the sea in their thousands of sacks, to be combed and spun and woven in the very cloth towns she had grown up among. Where the wool went, men followed after it, and there had long been folk of the Low Countries settled in England, weavers and merchants and fighting men. Some of them planted there by the Norman kings to hold rough country and to ply their useful trades. A girl of Brabant, bound for England, was following, in her own high royal way, a road that humbler people of her country had worn smooth long before her. She would find, when she came at last, that the faces were not wholly foreign to her, and that the speech among the merchants of the ports was one she could half follow. For the tongue of the Low Countries and the older English tongue were cousins, sprung together from the same northern root before the Normans ever came. None of this made England home, and none of it would spare her the labour of learning a court and a people from the beginning. But it made the island a little less of a wilderness than it might have looked from the far side of the water, and it is worth our holding on to as we imagine her crossing, that she went not into a blank and an unknown void, but into a country already bound to her own by 100 quiet threads of trade and settlement and kinship of speech. Her father's merchants had letters and dealings there. Her father's church had its brothers and its sisters in the English houses of religion. The world of the 12th century was wider than we sometimes imagine it, and its great families and its great churches reached across every sea. So that a well-born girl was never wholly among strangers, only with people she had not yet met. Henry was, by every account that reached the Low Countries, a formidable man. Men gave him the name Beauclerc, the fine scholar, for he had his letters when most great lords had none at all, and could take a written document into his own 2 hands and know what it said without a clerk to read it aloud to him. But it was not his learning that men spoke of first when they spoke of Henry of England. It was his firmness, which his enemies called cruelty, and his own officers called good order. He had come to his throne by a quick and fortunate stroke, when his elder brother William, called Rufus for his red colouring, had died of an arrow in a hunting forest, and Henry, who happened to be riding near that day, had spurred hard for the royal treasury and the crown, and secured them both before the sun went down. He had then fought and beaten his last remaining brother, Robert, wrested Normandy from his hands, and shut him away in a comfortable captivity for the whole long remainder of his life. This was the house Adeliza would one day marry into, a house that had risen by conquest and held on by sheer relentless will, and the man at its head was not a gentle man, but he was, above all things and before all things, effective. Under his hand, England lay quieter than it had lain in living memory. The roads were safer for a merchant's pack, the king's coin was sound and trusted, and the king's justice reached into corners of the shires it had never troubled to reach before. It was a hard peace, bought with a hard hand, but it was a peace, and the men who remembered the years before, it knew the worth of that. And Henry, for all his hardness, had built his rule on more than fear alone. He had married well and shrewdly at the very start of his reign, taking to wife a princess of the old English royal line, another Matilda, Ardgorn of the King of Scots, and descended, through her mother, from the ancient kings of Wessex, from Alfred the Great and Edmund Ironside, and the long broken line the Conqueror had swept aside. In marrying her, Henry had knotted the new Norman power to the old English blood, and made his children heirs not only to the conquerors, but to the conquered as well, a knot that quietly steadied the whole uneasy kingdom beneath him. That first Matilda had been a good queen by every measure of the age, pious and charitable, and endlessly busy about the proper work of a queen, and she had given the king the one thing a ruler needs above rubies, which is children who lived past their cradles. A daughter, yet another Matilda, married off while still a small girl to the emperor away in Germany, so that men would call her the Empress for the rest of her days. And a son, William, given the old English style of the Adelin, the prince of the royal blood, the single boy on whom the entire joined future of England and Normandy was made to rest. This, then, was the England that lay across the water, while Adeliza was still a child in Louvain. A kingdom held hard and held well, governed by an aging monarch with letters and an iron hand, steadied by a marriage that bound the old blood to the new, and pointed toward its future through the person of one living son. From the outside, it looked a structure entirely secure. The king was old, but by no means failing. The heir was young and healthy, and already being led before the barons, and shown to them as their lord to come. The good queen had died, it was true, in 1118, leaving the king a widower, but a widower with a grown and healthy heir has no pressing need to marry again. The house of the Conqueror seemed set to pass whole and unbroken from the father, straight down to the son, exactly as such houses were meant to pass. We know, as Adeliza far off in Brabant could not, how narrow such securities truly are. Everything in that careful structure ran through the single life of one young man, William the Adelin, and one life is a slender thread on which to hang a whole kingdom. But no one thought so in those confident years. The boy was near to full manhood. He was being married himself into the great county of Anjou, to bind the troublesome southern border of Normandy. He was being taken across the water and shown to the lords of the duchy as their heir. In the autumn of 1120, the old man and the travelling court and the young heir gathered on the Norman coast to cross home to England. Their business on the continent finished, the succession as firm as the wit of man could make it. They came down at last to the harbour of Barfleur to take ship for home. And it is there, on that stony Norman shore, in the cold and the dark of a November night, that the entire shape of Adeliza's life was quietly decided, while she was a girl in Louvain who knew nothing whatever of any of it. That is the night we must go to now, and it is not a gentle one, so we will pass through it slowly and come out the far side of it into calmer water. But it must be crossed, for without it there is no queen at all in this story, and no reason on earth for a girl of Brabant to be sent for across the sea. The harbour of Barfleur lies on the northern tip of the Norman coast, a stony inlet facing across the water toward England, and on the evening of the 25th of November in 1120, it was crowded with the king's returning household, waiting on the wind. Henry himself had already made his own arrangements to sail, but there was a second vessel in the harbour that night, newly built and much admired, a swift ship called the Blanche-Neuf, the White Ship, whose master had come humbly to the king and begged the honour of carrying him home, on the ground that his own father had ferried the great conqueror across to England on the very night of the invasion, long ago. The king gave the master a gracious answer, and said that though he himself was already promised to another vessel, his son, the heir, and the whole young company of the court might go aboard the White Ship in his stead. And so the very flower of that court, the young lords and their ladies, the king's own son, William the Adelin, and a bright crowd of the high-born young who had made the crossing into an occasion, went down to the fine new ship in the last of the failing light. What happened next was told and retold for 100 years afterward, until it became one of those events by which people fix the very turning of an age. The bright company was in high and reckless spirits. Wine was brought aboard in great quantity, and the crew fell to drinking along with the passengers, and the drinking ran on into the dark. Some priests who came down to the water to bless the voyage were laughed away from the ship. The night was clear and cold, and the sea was flat calm, and when at last the White Ship put out, late, long after the king's own vessel had slipped away, the rowers pulled hard, urged on by the wine in their blood, and by the boast that they would overtake the king before ever England was sighted. But the mouth of Barfleur harbour is guarded by rocks that a sober pilot takes slow and wide. The White Ship, driven fast through the dark by men who had drunk too deep to reckon their course, struck one of those rocks hard with her side. The blow stove in the timbers below the waterline, and the black sea came pouring in, and the beautiful new ship began to settle and go down where she stood. For one moment there was a chance at a single life. The young heir was got quickly into a small boat and pushed off from the sinking ship, and had he only been rowed straight for the shore he would have lived, and this whole history would have been a wholly different one. But over the noise of the water and the crying he heard the voice of his own half-sister, one of the king's natural daughters, calling out to him from the wreck as it went under. He could not leave her to it. He ordered the little boat turned back to take her off, and as it came in close again to the foundering ship, so many of the drowning flung themselves toward it and caught at its sides that it was swamped and rolled over, and the heir of all England went down into the black November water with everyone else. Of that whole bright company, the chroniclers tell us, only a single man lived to see the morning, a butcher of Rouen named Berold, who had come aboard only to collect some debts owed him, and who caught hold of the ship's mast, where it floated and clung there through the freezing night until fishermen found him at dawn, half dead with cold. Everyone else was lost. The king's only lawful son was lost. The ship, the calm sea, the little delay for wine, a single rock in the dark, and a kingdom's whole future was gone under the water inside the space of an hour. It is worth pausing to feel the sheer scale of what was lost that night, for it was a good deal more than one young man, terrible as that one loss was. The white ship had carried some 200 souls or near it, and the greater part of them were the young of the very highest houses of England and Normandy, the sons and the daughters and the heirs of earls and barons, a whole rising generation of the ruling families gathered together for a single crossing. When the ship went down, it took not only the king's son, but a broad swathe of the flower of two lands, brothers and sisters and cousins of the great, young men who would have been the earls and the captains of the next age, the women who would have been its great ladies and the mothers of its lords. There was scarcely a noble house on either shore that did not lose someone dear to it in that black water, and the grief of it ran through the whole of that world like a crack through a bell. And because so many died together, and died so needlessly, the wreck fixed itself in the memory of the age as few events ever did. Men spoke of it for 100 years and more as the moment when fortune turned her wheel and cast down the mighty at the very height of their pride. The fine new ship and the drunken crew and the calm sea and the one rock, and the heir of England drowned within sight of safety for the sake of turning back. The chroniclers drew their hard lessons from it, of the vanity of earthly glory and the suddenness of death, and preachers used it in their sermons. But beneath the moralizing lay the plain political ruin of it, which was this. A single night had not merely killed a prince, it had broken the careful succession of a great kingdom, undone the work of a whole reign, and set the old king to begin again from nothing, with the years running out behind him. That is why the search for a new bride was so swift and so urgent, and why it reached before long all the way to a hall on the Digely. The king did not yet know it. He had sailed on his own ship and come safe to England, and for a day and more, no man among his people dared bring him the news. They say that when at last the truth was told to him by a boy sent in weeping, because no grown man had the heart for it, Henry fell to the ground as though struck dead, and that he was never afterwards seen to smile as freely as he had smiled before. Whatever we make of the tale in its finer particulars, the fact at the centre of it is hard and plain, and it cannot be softened. The old king, who had built so carefully, who had bound the old blood to the new, and pointed his whole kingdom at one living son, had lost that son in a night, to nothing grander than carelessness and cold water. The heir was drowned, the empress was far away in Germany, a woman, married into another realm entirely, and Henry, past 50 now, was a widower with no lawful son at all, and a crown and a duchy, and no one settled to receive them after him. Consider for a moment how few doors were truly open to the old king in his grief. He had natural sons in plenty, grown and able, and Robert of Gloucester chief among them. But the church would not have a bastard crowned, and the barons would not follow one, and Henry knew it, and never seriously tried. He had nephews, the sons of his sister Stephen and his elder brother Theobald, and these were possibilities of a kind, but they were a step removed from the direct line, and each carried his own difficulties. And he had his daughter the Empress, lawful and of the highest dignity, but far away, a woman, and married into a foreign house. None of these was a clean and certain heir of the sort the old king craved, a lawful son of his own body, who could be raised and shown and settled beyond dispute. And so his eye turned, as such an eye must, toward the only remedy that could still give him exactly that, a new marriage and a new son. It was not certain to work. He was old, and the getting of a child is never sure. But it was the one path that led, if it led anywhere, to the thing he most wanted. And a man in Henry's position does not refuse the one good chance, because it is not a certainty. He would marry again, and quickly, and hope. Everything else, the nephews, the daughter, the oath he would, in the end, wring from his barons, was second best, a fallback against the failure of the first plan. The first plan was Adeliza. She was fetched across Europe to be the mother of the heir who would set everything right. And it is the great quiet sorrow at the root of her story that the first plan failed, and the kingdom was left to the bitter second bests and the war they bred. Now, at last, we can see plainly why a girl in Brabant should suddenly matter so much. For a king in Henry's position has really only one remedy open to him, and it is an old and simple and urgent one. He must marry again, and marry quickly, and get himself another son while there is still a little time left to do it. He was not too old to hope for it. Men of his years fathered children readily enough in that age, and Henry above most, as we shall see. But he needed a wife, and not merely any wife. He needed a bride young enough to bear him children, well born enough to honour the crown she would be given to wear, and tied to a house whose friendship was worth the buying. The choice, when it was made, fell upon the Low Countries, upon the rich and rising duchy of Lower Lotharingia, and upon the fair young daughter of its duke. It fell upon Adeliza of Louvain. She had spent her whole girlhood not knowing that a ship had gone down off Barfleur. She would spend the entire rest of her life living inside the long consequences of it. And even now the messengers were being made ready to ride north and east, up the roads toward Louvain on the Digelet, to ask the Duke for his daughter, and to bring her back across the water to be the wife of the King of the English. We should sit a moment with how all of this must have looked from her own side of it, before the diplomacy carries us forward. She was perhaps 17, perhaps 18. A young woman of a great house who had always known she would one day be married off for policy, and who had grown up expecting more or less exactly this kind of summons. But to be asked for by the King of England himself, to be lifted in a single stroke from the daughter of a continental duke into a crowned and anointed queen across the sea, was a good deal more than any ordinary match. It was the very summit of what a woman of her birth could ever reach, and it carried its weight along with its glory. It would take her far from home, into a strange country, with a strange tongue and a much older husband, and a fresh grief already sitting heavy in the house she would enter. It would lay upon her, from the very first day, the single overriding duty above all the others, to give the old king the son that the sea had taken from him. She would not have been asked what she thought of any of it. She would only have been told and made ready and sent. But she was not, by every sign we have of her, a woman who went unwilling or who carried her fate badly. She would meet it, as we will see her meet everything, with a steadiness that lasted the whole length of her long life. For now, let the shape of it settle over you. A calm sea, a fast new ship, a night of too much wine. And one rock in the dark had emptied a throne of its air and turned the eyes of an aging king clean across Europe toward Brabant. The next thing that would happen to Adeliza of Louvain was that envoys would come riding up the road to her father's hall, and everything she had ever known would begin, quietly, to be packed away into carts. That is where we go next, into the making of the match, and the long cold journey west, and the winter wedding waiting at the end of it. The negotiation itself has not come down to us in its particulars, as such negotiations almost never do, but we can read its shape clearly enough from what it finally produced. Henry's envoys would have come to Duke Godfrey bearing the king's offer, and it was an offer that no rising prince could refuse, nor would ever have wished to. For Godfrey to set his own daughter upon the throne of England was a triumph far beyond the ordinary run of alliances. It bound his house to the greatest king of the western seaboard, gave him a real claim upon that king's friendship and protection, and planted his blood, should the marriage only bear fruit, directly in the line of the kings of England yet to come. For Henry, the match brought a young and well-born bride out of a house whose goodwill was genuinely useful to him, sitting, as it did, athwart the trade and the shifting politics of the north. There would have been long talk between the clerks of both sides, of her dower and her dowry, of the lands and the revenues she would hold in England as its queen, of the escort that would bring her over, of the churchmen who would see the marriage properly and lawfully made. And then, the terms being settled and sealed, there was nothing left to do but make the girl ready and send her upon her way. Think for a moment on what that leaving actually was, under the glory of it. She was going to a country she had never once seen, whose language she did not speak a word of, whose people were all strangers to her. To marry a man more than 30 years her elder, whom she had never so much as met. She would in all likelihood never see her home again, nor her father's hall, nor the slow brown river she had grown up beside, save perhaps once or twice across a long life, if fortune were unusually kind. She would carry with her only a small company of her own, a few women of her household, a chaplain to say her prayers in the tongue she knew, some servants. The handful of faces from home that a bride was permitted to bring into her new life, so that she would not be left entirely alone in a sea of strangers. And she would take her clothes and her jewels and whatever small and portable things a young woman keeps to remind herself of who she had been before, and every other thing she had ever known she would simply leave behind her. This was the ordinary price of being a daughter of such a house, and she had always known she would have to pay it. But knowing a thing is coming does not make the morning of it light to bear. So the bride set out west. We do not have the day-by-day record of her journey, as we have so little of her. But we can follow its bones well enough. From Louvain, the road ran west and north across the flat country she knew by heart, through the busy cloth towns and over the slow rivers. And down at last toward the grey coast, where the ships lay waiting on the weather. The company would have moved only at the plodding pace of its baggage carts, resting at abbeys along the way, and at the halls of lords who owed her father their courtesy. The young bride carried along in the midst of it all, like a treasure being moved under guard, which is exactly what she was. At the coast they would have waited, perhaps for days, for a wind and a sky that would let them cross. For no one put out into that water in the depth of winter, save when the weather plainly allowed it. And the crossing itself, when at last it came, would have been the hardest passage of the whole journey for her heart, whatever the sea did. For she was going over the very stretch of water that had so lately swallowed the king's own son. She cannot possibly have made that passage without the thought of the white ship somewhere near the front of her mind, for the entire reason she sat in that cabin at all was that other ship gone down. But she came over safe, into an English harbour in the deep cold of winter, and was met upon the shore, and brought inland under escort to the king who had sent for her. The bringing of a royal bride across Europe was itself a great undertaking, and it is worth dwelling on. For it was the last journey of her old life, and the first of her new. A bride of her rank did not travel lightly or alone. She went in the midst of a great company, guarded by armed men against the robbers and the chancers who haunted the roads, attended by the lords and the churchmen whose task it was to deliver her safely and with honour into her husband's keeping. There would have been carts heavy with her goods and her dower, her clothes and her plate, and the furnishings of her chamber. All the portable wealth that a great marriage moved from one house to another. The whole slow procession would have been a thing of some display, for it carried the honour of two houses upon it, and neither her father nor the king, who had sent for her, would have wished it to look mean upon the road. At every stage there were arrangements to be made, lodging to be found in abbeys and in the halls of friendly lords, provisions to be got, the weather and the roads to be reckoned with. And over it all lay the strangeness, for the girl at its centre, of watching her own country fall away behind her, mile by mile, the familiar towns and rivers, giving way to stranger ones. The speech about her on the road, shifting by degrees as she went, until at the coast, even the land itself ran out, and there was only the grey water and the waiting ship. We do not know who rode with her, or what was said, or how she bore the last night on the near shore before the crossing. But we know that the journey was made, in the deep of winter, across many miles and one dangerous sea, and that it delivered her, safe and whole, into a country where she knew no one, and everything was to be begun. That she made it at all, at 17 or 18, and made it without any sign of faltering that has come down to us, is the first quiet proof of the steadiness that would mark her whole long life. They were married at Windsor on the 24th day of January in 1121, a little more than 2 months after the sea had taken the air and made the whole marriage necessary. Windsor, in the last week of January, is not a soft or a welcoming place. The Thames runs slow and iron grey below the castle mound. The trees along its banks stand bare and black. The ground is hard with frost in the morning and heavy with cold rain by the afternoon, and the daylight fails early and comes late and grudging. Into all of this the young woman of Brabant came, to be given to the aging king in the chapel of his castle, before his assembled bishops and his barons, in a tongue that was not her own and that she was still only beginning to gather. We can furnish the scene from what such royal weddings were. The hall hung with what colour the winter season allowed, the fires built high against the cold that seeped from the stone. The household turned out in its very best. The churchmen grave in their vestments, the slow exchange of consent, the giving of the ring, the long mass, and then the feast that followed with its roasted meats and its spiced and heated wine, and its careful, watchful precedence of who was seated where and above whom. And at the very heart of all of it, a girl not yet 20 and a man past 50, joined together for reasons of state that every last soul in that hall understood without a word being said, she to give him a son, he to give her a crown. There was one small stumble in the ceremony that the chroniclers troubled themselves to record, and it tells us something worth knowing about the man she was marrying. The bishop who was to perform the marriage, Roger of Salisbury, one of Henry's chief and most trusted servants in the government of the realm, raised some objection. Some point of right and precedence about which churchmen ought properly to have the honour of joining the king and his new queen. It was exactly the kind of quarrel over dignity that could turn poisonous among proud men if it were let run. Henry brushed it aside without ceremony and had the thing simply done. It is a small window, that moment, but through it you catch a clear glimpse of the king as he was inside his own house. A man who would not let his servants' squabbles over precedence slow his purposes by so much as an hour, who wanted the marriage made and therefore made it. And Adeliza, standing new and strange and cold in the middle of it all, was learning her husband in the very first hour of her marriage to him. He was not a warm man, by any account that survives. But he was a man who got things done and swept the small obstacles aside, and there was a kind of hard safety in that for a young queen, so far from home, if there was not in it a good deal of tenderness. Windsor itself was already a favoured seat of the Norman kings when Adeliza came to it as a bride, and it is worth seeing the place as it then was, for it was not yet the vast stone palace of later ages. It stood upon its steep mound above the Thames, a castle of the old fashion, its great earthwork crowned with a keep and ringed with a bailey, and its hall and its chambers and its chapel, strong and plain, and built for use rather than for beauty. The kings liked it for its hunting, for the forest that lay thick about it and ran with the deer they loved, and for its nearness to London and to the road. And Henry kept much of his court there. In the deep of winter, it would have been a hard, cold, and a crowded place, its rooms full of the smoke of many fires, its yards churned to mud, its every corner pressed with the people of a large household gathered in out of the weather. Into this the bride came, and it was here that she first truly saw the shape of the life that lay before her. The court would have been assembled in its strength for the wedding, the great men and their ladies drawn in from across the kingdom, so that she met, in those first crowded days, a good part of the world she would now live among. She would have been studied by every eye, weighed and measured, this foreign girl the old king had sent so far to fetch, and she would have known it, and borne it. The winter light came thin and grey through the narrow windows. The fires roared, the strange tongue washed about her, and somewhere in the midst of it stood the man she had married, more than 30 years her elder. Watching her too, with whatever a hard old man felt on looking at the young wife who was to mend his broken house. It was a good deal for a girl to walk into. She walked into it, by every sign, with her head up. We should not judge that marriage by the measure of our own day, for it was a thing of its own age and made complete sense within it. A marriage between the great was not, first of all, a matter of the heart. It was a treaty made flesh, a joining of houses and lands and interests, sealed by the bodies of a man and a woman who might be strangers to one another, and often were. The wide gap of years between Adeliza and Henry, which strikes us so hard, would have troubled almost no one then. Kings married young women for the plain reason that young women bore children, and an old king, needing an heir, took a youthful bride as a matter of course, and no one thought it strange. The girl's own wishes were simply not part of the reckoning. She was the instrument of her house's policy, valuable and cared for as a precious instrument is cared for, but not consulted. And within that hard frame, much still depended on the temper of the two people bound together. And here Adeliza was, on the whole, fortunate. Her husband was old and stern, but he was not cruel to her, and he kept her in honour, and gave her a great station, and seems to have valued her company. Many a girl handed over in such a match fared a good deal worse, married to a brute or a fool, or a man who despised her, with no escape and no appeal. Adeliza was given to a formidable man who treated her well by the standards of the thing, and who asked of her only the one duty that the whole world agreed a queen owed. That the duty proved impossible was nobody's cruelty, only the hard luck of two bodies that would not answer. Seen rightly, in its own light, her first marriage was neither a tragedy nor a triumph, but an ordinary great match of its age. Born with uncommon grace by the young woman at the heart of it, and lit, here and there, by real regard between the mismatched pair. What did she feel, that grey winter day at Windsor? We cannot know it, and I will not go inventing a heart for her that the records do not give. But we can say plainly what her situation was. She had been lifted to the very highest place a woman of her birth could reach, and then set down in it among strangers, in the deep cold, at the side of an old king, with a raw grief already in his house, and a single overriding expectation laid upon her from the outset. She was a crowned queen in prospect before she had properly learned the country's speech. She had done, at not yet 20 years of age, the very largest thing she would ever be asked to do, which was simply to arrive, and to marry, and to begin. Whatever fear or loneliness she carried into that cold chapel, she carried it well, and kept it to herself. For what follows in her life is the record of a woman who did her duty with grace, and won by every sign we have. The real regard of a hard husband, and the good opinion of a difficult and watchful court. The wedding at Windsor was the door she came in through. On the far side of it, she was the wife of the King of England, and there remained now only one more great ceremony to make the thing whole. The ceremony that would set the crown itself upon her head, and lift her from a king's wife into a kingdom's queen. That ceremony was her coronation, and it followed hard upon the wedding, for a king wanted his new queen crowned and anointed, and shown to the realm as its lady without any needless delay. Where the wedding had made her Henry's bride, the crowning would make her England's queen, and the two things were by no means the same. A marriage was a private bond between two people sworn before God. But a crowned and anointed queen was a public office and a public person, a sharer in the very mystery of kingship. set apart from all other women by the touch of holy oil, and raised into a station that the Church itself formally recognized and blessed. The anointing was the true heart of it. Just as the king, at his own crowning, was touched with the sacred chrism, and thereby made into something more than a mere lord among lords, so the queen at hers was anointed and lifted above the common rank of the highborn into a sanctified place beside him. It was an old rite, this, heavy with the weight of long meaning, and for a girl out of Brabant to pass through it was to be genuinely remade into something that her own countrymen would now bow their heads before. Picture the thing itself, for it was made from beginning to end to be looked upon. The great church, most likely at Westminster, where such rites were done, filled to its cold stone walls with the whole gathered strength of the kingdom, the bishops in their tall mitres, the earls and the barons in their richest furs and stuffs, the royal household drawn up in strict order of its ranks. The young queen brought in with every ceremony, robed in cloth of great price, and led up through them all to the place prepared for her. The prayers, the long and solemn Latin that she was still learning to follow with her ear. The grave moment when she was anointed with the holy oil upon her head, the setting of the crown upon her brow, the giving into her hands of the ring and the rod that were the ancient tokens of a queen's office. And then the queen shone crowned to the people, and the shout of acclamation, and the great high mass, and afterward the coronation feast, the single most magnificent table that the court could possibly set, where the new queen sat crowned beside her crowned king, while the realm did her honour and drank her health. For a young woman only 2 months arrived in the country, it must have been overwhelming and dreamlike at once. The strangeness of it all made stranger yet by the enormous weight of the ceremony and by the eyes of an entire kingdom turned upon her small figure at its centre. But beneath all the splendour there lay the plain hard fact of what Queen was actually for. In that age, and Adeliza would have understood it every bit as well as the bishops who anointed her. A queen's first duty, standing above her charity and her patronage and her honoured place at her husband's side, was to bear children of her body. The realm did not crown her only to do her honour. It anointed her because it needed heirs from her, and it looked to her from that day forward to provide them. Every eye that watched her anointed would watch also, in the seasons to come, for the first sign that the broken succession was being mended in her. This was the burden folded up carefully inside the honour, and it was a heavy one, made heavier still by the particular emptiness in this king's house, by the drowned son whose vacant place she was expected to fill with another. She came to her crown, then already carrying the single largest hope of the whole kingdom upon her, and we will see, as the years turn, how that hope, unfulfilled through all the long waiting, came to shape the entire middle stretch of her life, but that is to run ahead of ourselves. For now she was crowned and anointed, Queen of England, wife of King Henry, a girl of Brabant, wholly remade into the lady of a realm. And it is worth simply pausing here to mark how very far she had travelled from that hall on the Digel in so short a span of months. It is worth lingering a moment on what the anointing of a queen truly meant, for it was no mere ornament upon the anointing of the king. The rite had come down through generations, and the prayers said over a queen as the oil touched her were old and deliberate. They asked God to bless her as he had blessed the great mothers of Scripture, to make her fruitful, to grant that she might see her children's children, to set her as a helpmeet and a partner in the rule of the realm. The very words of her crowning then spoke aloud the thing that everyone hoped of her, that she would bear. Fertility was written into the ceremony itself, invoked over her head in the sight of the whole church, so that the hope she carried was not merely a private expectation, but a thing the kingdom had solemnly prayed for at the very hour it made her queen. There was a weight in that which we should not miss. Thinking back on Adeliza's long childlessness, she had stood beneath those prayers, been blessed with the blessing of the fruitful mothers of old, been asked of God before the realm that she might see her children's children. And season upon season, the blessing went unanswered, the prayer of her own crowning, unfulfilled. For a devout woman, that must have carried a particular sting to have been prayed over so publicly and so hopefully, and to feel the years pass with the prayer hanging empty in the air. The crown that was set on her head that day was a real honour and a real power. But it was also, from the very first, a question asked of her body, asked in holy words before God and the kingdom, and it was a question that her first marriage never let her answer. She wore the honour with grace. The question she could only carry, and wait, and hope, and in the end, hand on, unanswered, to another woman. Before we follow the story forward, we should turn and look properly at the man she had married, for he stood at the very centre of her life for the next 14 years. And to understand her at all, we must first understand him. He was, when Adeliza married him, a man of some 52, which in that age was reckoned old, though he was still far from a spent force. He had been King of England for 21 years already, and Duke of Normandy for very nearly as long. And he had spent every one of them holding fast to what he had against a world that would gladly have taken it from him. He was the youngest of all the conqueror's sons. The one born after his father had already won England, the one for whom there had at first seemed to be no great inheritance waiting at all, only a chest of silver coin and his own wits. Out of that unpromising beginning, he had made himself the master of everything his father had ever held, outliving one brother, defeating and imprisoning the other, and gathering all of it into his own 2 hands. A man does not do such a thing by gentleness, and Henry was not a gentle man. But neither was he merely a cruel one. He was, above all else, a man of order and of iron will, who believed to his core that a kingdom held firmly was a kingdom at peace, and who was proved, on the whole, right in that belief. Men called him Beauclerc, the fine scholar, and it was a name well worth the having in a world where most great lords could not follow so much as a line of written script. Henry had his letters. He could take a document into his own hands and know what it truly said, and in an age of clerks and charters and the slow, steady spread of written government, that was a weapon quite as real and as sharp as any sword. His reign is remembered above all for the machinery of rule that he built and trusted and refined. The exchequer, where his revenues were reckoned and audited twice in every year. The royal justices who carried his law out into the shires. The sheriffs whom he watched with a hard eye and punished without mercy when they cheated him of what was his. He wanted to know exactly what was his, and to have every last penny of it, and he built the patient machinery that would let him know. This was the king in his working life, bent over his accounts, hearing pleas of law, moving his court endlessly from manor to manor across 2 lands, a restless and near sleepless administrator, who trusted very few and forgot nothing at all. He was also, and this touches Adeliza's story very closely, a man of strong appetites. Henry fathered more children outside of wedlock than any other king of England before or since. Some 20 and more sons and daughters got upon a long roll of women, and he acknowledged them openly and used them well, marrying his natural daughters to useful lords along his borders, and raising his natural sons to service and to honour. The most notable of them all was Robert, whom the king made Earl of Gloucester, a man of real weight and steady loyalty, who would come to stand at the very centre of the troubles that followed his father's death. So Henry was by no means a man who lacked for children, nor one who had ever found the getting of them hard. And this is precisely the bitter irony that sat coiled at the middle of his second marriage. He had children in plenty, a whole generation of them, but he did not have the one child he actually needed. A lawful son born to him by his crowned queen, and no amount of proven fatherhood could conjure that single child out of the few years that were left to him. Adeliza had married a man who had sired an entire generation, and could not, with her, get the one heir that the whole kingdom was crying out for. We should not think of Henry only as a cold clerk bent over his accounts, for there was more colour to the man and to his court than that. He kept, at his manor of Woodstock, one of the wonders of his age, a park in which he gathered strange beasts sent to him from the far corners of the world by other princes who wished to please him. There were lions there, and leopards, and the spotted catsmen called lynxes, and camels brought from the hot lands of the south, and most marvellous of all to the people who came to gape at it, a porcupine. A beast so strange to English eyes that a learned man of the court troubled to write down a careful description of its quills. A king who keeps a menagerie of lions and camels in an English park is not a man wholly given over to grey business. He had in him something of the collector, something that loved the rare and the far-fetched and the marvellous. And Adeliza, coming to him with her own love of books of beasts, may have found in that a small and unexpected meeting of minds. He loved the hunt above almost all other pleasures, as his whole house did, and kept great forests under a hard law for it, where the killing of the king's deer was punished as heavily as an assault upon a man. He built much and built well, castles and halls, and the abbey at Reading that would hold his bones. He gathered learned men about him, and clerks who could write, and his court, for all its hardness, was a place where the business of a sophisticated government was carried on with a skill that was ahead of its time. This was the world that Adeliza had married into. Then, not merely an old man and a hard duty, but a court of lions and clerks and hunters and builders, rich and restless and formidable, moving without cease across two lands under the eye of a king who missed nothing. She had her place at the very head of it, beside him, the still crowned figure at the centre of all that motion, and she filled the place with a grace that no one, in all the long record, ever thought to fault. What was he like, then, to live beside, day upon day? Cold in his rule, certainly, and widely feared, and given to sudden hard strokes of justice that could shade over into plain cruelty. He blinded and maimed men who crossed him, or coined false money, or betrayed the trust he had placed in them, and he did not flinch from the doing of it. And yet the very same man could be firmly bound by his given word, was capable of a long and patient loyalty toward those who served him faithfully and kept about him by the rough standards of his house. A court of some learning and some real splendour. Toward Adeliza herself, all the signs that survive suggest that he was, if never exactly tender, and then careful and honourable in his dealings. He settled rich lands and a proper queen's estate upon her. He kept her often near him, and she travelled a very great deal in his company, which was by no means always the way with the wives of kings. There is not one breath of unkindness between the two of them in any record we have, no sign that he ever blamed her openly for the son that would not come, though the realm knew well enough what was hoped for and what was so painfully lacking. For a marriage made out of pure cold policy, between a hard old king and a young foreign bride, it seems to have been, in its own quiet way, a genuinely working and even a companionable one. She was a good wife to him by every measure of the age, and he, within the narrow room that a man of his nature had for such things, a fair enough husband to her. And so we can begin to see her now, in these first married years, settling slowly into her strange new life beside this formidable and unsleeping man. She learned the country and its speech. She came to know the court and its many watchful people, who was to be trusted and who was not, whose favour mattered and whose did not. She learned her husband, his moods and his methods, the restless rhythm of his ceaseless travelling rule. She took up all the things that a queen did, which we will come to shortly, and she waited, as the whole kingdom around her waited, for the one thing that stubbornly did not come. The years of Henry's second marriage were years of a hard, competent, unsleeping old king growing steadily older with a young wife at his side, and both of them, the whole while, shadowed by the same unspoken and unanswered hope, and both of them, as the seasons turned over, one into another, coming slowly and privately to understand that the hope might in the end never be met at all. But before we follow that lengthening shadow into its own place in her story, let us look first at what her ordinary days were actually made of, the daily round of a queen in Henry's England. For a life is truly lived in its ordinary hours, and Adeliza had a good many of them to fill. A queen's life in that age was not an idle one. Whatever the soft word queen might suggest to us now across the centuries, it was a busy round, and a good deal of the business of it was the running of a large household, her own establishment set within the far larger household of the king. Adeliza had her own officers and her own servants, her own chamber, and the women who kept it, her own lands to be managed, and her own revenues to be gathered in and spent, her own chapel, and her own chaplains, her own gifts to give, and her own petitions to hear and weigh. The whole of this was hers to oversee, and the oversight of it was real and constant work. The work of a great lady managing a small kingdom of people and property that moved along with her wherever in the land she happened to go. For the court did move, endlessly and without rest. Henry's household was almost never still for long. It travelled from manor to manor and from castle to castle across the length of England and over the sea to Normandy, eating its way steadily through the stored provisions of one estate and then packing up and moving on to the next. And the Queen and her whole establishment moved along with it, packed and unpacked, on the muddy roads for weeks at a stretch, truly at home, nowhere and everywhere at once. Think of what that meant in the plain daily texture of her hours, the endless packing and carrying of the household's goods, the beds and the hangings and the plate and the heavy iron-bound coffers, all loaded onto carts and onto the backs of pack animals and hauled slowly along the rutted, mired roads of a winter kingdom. The arrival, at dusk, at each fresh place, the airing out of cold and long-shut chambers, the hanging of the Queen's own tapestries upon the bare walls, so that some corner of the shifting world was always recognisably hers, no matter where the court had come to rest for the night. The daily ordering of her women, the high-born girls and ladies who served her and kept her company, and whom she in her turn was bound to guide, to protect, and to see honourably married in their time. The long hours of the church, for she was a pious woman in a deeply pious age, and the offices of prayer marked out her day as they marked out everyone's, from matins in the black cold before dawn, through the Mass, and down the whole round of the hours, to compline and to sleep. And threaded through all of it, the Queen's necessary public face, the receiving of those who came to her with requests, the giving of her patronage and her charity, the standing crowned and still at her husband's side through the great feasts and the great councils where the realm put itself grandly on display. The lands that made her a wealthy woman were scattered across the kingdom, and the managing of them was a real and a constant business. A queen held estates of her own, granted to her at her marriage as her dower, from which came the rents and the dues and the produce that paid for her household and her charity and her gifts. These had to be watched, and their officers kept honest, and their revenues gathered in and spent wisely, and a great lady who did not attend to such things soon found herself cheated and poor. Adeliza, by every sign, attended to hers. She held towns and manors whose names appear here and there in the dry records of the age, granting this, confirming that, remembering a church or an abbey with a gift of land or of rent. Through these small surviving traces, we can see her, faintly, at the ordinary work of a busy landholder, the work that filled far more of her days than any ceremony did. A queen was also, by the custom of the age, an intercessor, a channel through which mercy might reach the hard machinery of the king's justice. Men and women who dared not approach the king directly might approach the queen, and beg her to speak for them, to soften a judgment, or to win a favour, or to remind the king of some old service. This was a real and a valued part of a queen's office, the gentler face that the crown could turn toward its people, and it suited a woman of Adeliza's temper. She gave, too, to the poor and to the church, as piety and station alike required, endowing prayers, remembering the sick and the leprous, founding and enriching houses of religion. None of this was glamorous, and little of it was written down. And so it is easy to pass it by, but it was the true substance of a good queen's working life, the daily giving and managing and interceding through which she earned the love of her people and the good opinion of the church. And Adeliza earned both. When the chroniclers troubled to name her at all, they named her good, and it was in this quiet daily round, far more than upon any throne, that the goodness was made. To feel the real texture of it, imagine a single ordinary day of the moving court. It begins before light, in a chamber that was cold and strange a week ago, and will be left behind a week hence. With the bells for the first office and the slow waking of a large household in a place that is not its own. There is the mass, and then the business of the morning, the petitioners and the letters and the ordering of the day. And often, over it all, the word that the court moves on, and then the whole vast machine stirs into motion, the coffers packed, the hangings taken down from the walls and rolled, the beds dismantled, the plate wrapped, the carts loaded and the pack animals laden, until a house that was full and warm is stripped back to bare stone and the long train winds out onto the road. The road itself was the hard part. The miles of rutted track through mud or dust, the fording of streams, the slow pace of the baggage, the watch kept against the thieves who preyed on travellers, the weather that soaked or froze or baked the company by turns. And at the end of it, another cold house to be made warm and habitable by nightfall. The Queen's own hangings hung once more, so that some corner of the wandering world was hers again. The fires lit, the beds set up, the chapel readied, before it all began once more a few days later. This was not the life of ease that the word queen suggests. It was a life lived largely on the road, in the saddle and the cart in the strange cold chamber, and Adeliza lived it season upon season, following the king across two lands, and kept, through all the discomfort of it, the ordered household and the good name that mark her whole passage through the record. There was iron in her, under the grace. A soft woman could not have borne that life at all. Her private chambers were the true heart of her own small world, and they were a world made largely of women. The Queen's apartments were where her ladies gathered through the long days, where the fine needlework was done, the rich embroidery that great ladies both prized and practiced with real skill, where the talk of the household went quietly round, where music was made upon the harp and stories were told through the long evenings, while the candles burned down. This was the sheltered inner country of a queen's days, enclosed and female and warm, set carefully apart from the loud male sphere of the hall and the council chamber and the hunting field. Here, among her own, she was most herself. Here, we may fairly guess, she kept something of home about her, her own women out of Brabant, if any yet remained in her service, her own soft mother tongue perhaps still spoken low among the newer English and Norman speech, her own tastes given a little room to breathe. And it was in this inner world above all, that her love of books had its natural place. The one thing about her that speaks most clearly in something like her own voice across the long silence of the centuries. But the daily round, taken all in all, was a full and a demanding life. The life of a great lady set at the very top of a large household. And she seems by every sign to have carried it steadily and well. Yet over all of it, over the busy travelling days, and the moving court, and the warm, enclosed chambers, there hung always the one thing that was wanting. For a queen's whole round of duties, however full it kept her, was understood by everyone who watched her, and not least by herself. To be only the rich setting around a single central jewel that had not yet appeared. She was to bear a son. Everything else that she did as the wife who would, God willing, and in his good time, at last give the old king his heir. And as the months turned slowly into years, and they began quietly to mount up one upon another, and still no child came, that central emptiness began to press harder and harder upon her days, upon her marriage, and upon the whole watching kingdom that hung its future upon her. It is to that long waiting that we must turn now, gently, for it is the quiet sorrow that sits at the very middle of Adeliza's first marriage, and it shaped, in the end, everything that came after it. There is no grief in a royal marriage quite like the grief of the empty cradle, and Adeliza was made to carry it for 14 long years. She had been brought all the way across the sea for one purpose above every other, to give the aging king a son, and season after season, year following patient year, the son did not come. We do not have the private history of it. The small hopes carefully raised and then quietly let down again. The grave counsel of physicians, the pilgrimages made to holy shrines, and the offerings laid before them that a queen in her position would surely have undertaken. We know only the plain and stubborn outcome, that in all the years of her marriage to Henry, she bore him no living child at all, not a son, not a daughter, nothing that drew breath. And we know something else, which throws its own hard light back upon that time. We know that this was through no failing in her own body, for she would later marry again and bear a whole houseful of healthy children, 7 of them, by the best count that survives. The barrenness of that first marriage was not hers alone to answer for. It lay somewhere in the space between an aging king and his young wife, and its true cause is now well past our knowing. But its whole weight fell hardest upon her, as such weights in that age always fell upon the woman. Imagine the slow accumulation of it across the turning seasons. In the first year of the marriage, no matter at all, for these things are known to take their own time. In the second, perhaps a little quiet watching. By the third year and the fourth, the first whispered worry beginning to move through the court. The careful counting of the months, the reading of her face and her figure at every feast of the church calendar. And so it went on. And on, the worry hardening slowly into something much closer to despair, and not hers alone, but the whole kingdom's. For upon her body rested the entire hope of a peaceful succession. And her body did not answer. There survives the memory of a letter written to console her by a churchman of that time, a learned man who bid her not to grieve too deeply over her childlessness. And the very existence of such a letter of comfort tells us plainly how heavily the thing was felt by all, and how openly and how sorrowfully it was known and spoken of. She was a queen who could not do the one thing above all others that a queen was crowned and anointed to do, and she lived inside that public failure through no fault of her own, for the better part of 2 decades of her life. It is worth understanding how a barren queen was seen in that age, for it was not seen as we might see it now. Childlessness was read, by many, as a matter of the soul as much as of the body, a matter that might be a punishment for hidden sin, or a trial sent by God to be borne with patience, or a grief to be lifted by prayer and pilgrimage and the intercession of the saints. The holy women of Scripture were held up as examples, the ones who had been barren long, and then, by God's grace, had borne a child late and against all hope. Sarah in her old age, and Hannah weeping in the temple. A barren wife was pointed toward these, and bidden to pray and to hope, and not to despair, and to seek the shrines where women went to beg for children. We may be sure that Adeliza did all of this, for she was a pious woman, and the whole weight of her world pressed her toward it. And so her childlessness would have been, for her, not only a private sorrow and a public failure, but a religious trial, a thing to be wrestled with before God through long years of prayer that were not answered. The churchman who wrote to console her wrote within exactly this understanding, bidding her not to grieve, framing her empty arms as a cross to be carried rather than a fault to be ashamed of. Whether such words brought her any comfort, we cannot know. But they tell us that her trouble was known and spoken of and prayed over at the highest levels of the church, that she was not left to bear it in silence and alone, and that the age, for all its harshness, had at least a language of consolation to offer a woman in her place. She lived inside that language for 14 years, hoping and praying and not conceiving, until at last the old king died and the question was closed forever, unanswered, and her life turned toward a wholly different country. We should be careful here not to shrink her down into nothing more than a vessel that would not fill, for she was a good deal more than that. And the years of her marriage were far from empty of everything but disappointment. But we would be false to the shape of her life if we passed too lightly over the central sorrow that ran through the middle of it. The barren queen was a figure of both pity and of danger in that world, pity for the woman herself, and danger for the realm that depended upon her. And Adeliza was made to be that figure for 14 years together. What is genuinely remarkable is that she seems never once to have lost, through the whole long trial of it, either the regard of her husband or the good name that she held at his court. A lesser marriage might well have curdled and soured under such a lasting strain. A harder king than Henry, and he was hard enough, might have found the grounds to set a barren wife aside, as kings had done before when it suited them. Henry did not. Whatever passed between the two of them in private, in the public record, he kept her honourably as his queen to the very end of his life, and she kept her place and her dignity intact through all the long disappointment. That steadiness says something true about her, and perhaps something about him as well. And her body's failure to mend the succession had consequences that reached out far beyond her own private sorrow, out into the hard politics of the whole kingdom. For if the queen would give no heir, then the king was forced to look elsewhere for one, and where he was made to look would shake England to its foundations for a whole generation. This is the hinge on which the entire second half of Henry's long reign turned. Deprived of a lawful son by his second marriage, just as the sea had deprived him of one by his first, the old man was thrown back at last upon the only lawful child of his body who yet remained to him. His daughter, by his first wife, the Empress Matilda, away across the water in Germany. It was her own father's childlessness with Adeliza that lifted Matilda from a foreign empress into the named and designated heir of England, and set marching the long and bitter quarrel that followed Henry into his grave. So the empty cradle in the Queen's chamber was never only a private grief. It was, though no one wished it so, the very seed of a civil war. We will come to Matilda in her own proper place, for she runs strangely through the whole rest of Adeliza's life. But first, let us turn away from the sorrow for a while, towards something a good deal brighter, toward the one part of Adeliza's life that speaks most clearly in her own true voice, her deep love of books and her patronage of the men who made them. For here, at the least, we hear something of the woman herself, and not only of her body and her crown. Adeliza was, by the measure of any age, a real friend to letters. In an England where great ladies were only beginning to be the patrons and the readers, and now and then the very commissioners of books, she stood among the foremost of them. She gathered writers to her, and she paid them. And she asked things of them, and what she chose to ask tells us quietly what she cared about. Most strikingly of all, she wished to have the life and the deeds of her husband the king set down properly in verse. A full and dignified account of Henry's reign made into poetry that might be preserved and recited and remembered. She actively sought out a writer to undertake it. That a queen should want her husband's history written and should go deliberately about the commissioning of it shows a mind fully alive to the power of the written word to hold a whole existence against the tide of forgetting, which is, when you stop and think upon it, the very thing that you and I are doing for her together on this quiet evening. The most famous of all the works that are bound up with her name is a bestiary, one of those wonderful books of the medieval world that gathered up all the beasts of creation, the real ones and the fabled ones alike. The lion and the eagle and the whale and the strange self-burning phoenix, and told the nature of each one and drew from it a lesson for the soul of the reader. A writer named Philippe de Thion, one of the very earliest men we know of to have written his verse in the Norman French of the English court, rather than in the Latin of the Church, addressed his bestiary to Adeliza as queen, offering it up to her as to a lady who would truly value such a thing. We should hold the finer details of it lightly, for the exact ways in which such dedications worked are not always plain to us now, and careful scholars have long weighed just what her real part in these books may have been. But the broad pattern of it is clear enough, and it is a lovely one to hold. Here was a queen whose court was a place where the newer tongue was finding its first way onto the written page, where poets looked to her hand for their favour and their bread, where fine books were wanted and made and given as gifts. In an age that has left us so very little of the inner lives of its women, this is a real and precious window, and through it we do not see a barren queen or a mere pawn of policy at all, but a cultivated and thoughtful woman who loved the made thing, the shaped and ordered word, the strange beast drawn and gilded on the page with its little lesson set down beside it. Adeliza's patronage sat at the very front edge of something new, and that is part of what makes it worth remembering. In her day, the great tongue of learning was still Latin, the speech of the church and the schools and of every serious book. But alongside it, at the courts of England and Normandy, a new thing was stirring, the writing down of verse and story in the French of the nobility, the everyday speech of lords and ladies, so that those who had no Latin might still have books of their own. This was the beginning of a great flowering that would in time give the world its romances and its histories in the common tongue, and its earliest stirrings happened in exactly the courtly world that Adeliza inhabited, among exactly the high-born women who were its first eager patrons and readers. The verse life of King Henry that she wished to have made belonged to this new world. She sought out a writer, a poet, remembered only as David, to set her husband's reign down in French verse, a book that has not survived to our day, but whose making is remembered by a later writer who knew of it. Think of what that commission meant. A queen wished her husband's deeds preserved not only in the Latin of the monks, who would write of him in any case, but in the living speech of his own court, in verse that could be recited aloud in hall and understood by all who heard it. She wanted him remembered by the living, not only by the learned. It is a strikingly modern wish, in its way, and it places her among the founders of a whole tradition. Between the bestiary offered to her and the lost life she commissioned, we can see the shape of a court where the new writing was wanted and paid for and honoured, and a queen at the heart of it who understood, better than most princes of her age, that a life not written down is half lost, and who spent her patronage accordingly. It is worth dwelling a while here, in this warmer room of her story, before the colder chapters come on. Picture the Queen's chamber of an evening, the candles lit and steady, the fire banked low and red, her women gathered about her at their needlework, and a book lying open, its pages of scraped and whitened skin covered over in the careful, even hand of some clerk, its beasts picked out in bright colour and in gold leaf that caught the candlelight. Picture the poet brought in to offer up his new-made verses, and the Queen's quiet pleasure in them, and the small court of learning that she kept about her in the very middle of that hard, travelling, account-keeping reign. This was hers, in a way that almost nothing else in her life truly was. The crown belonged to the kingdom, the marriage belonged to policy, the longed-for son belonged to the realm and its future, but her love of books was her own, freely chosen and freely given, and it is very nearly the truest thing that we have of her across all this distance. Hold that picture of her steady, as we turn now to the harder matter that her childlessness had set quietly in motion, the raising up of another woman to be England's heir, and the long shadow that fell from it across everything. The Empress Matilda was Henry's daughter by his first wife, born some years before Adeliza herself was born, and by the time we meet her properly in this story, she was already a woman with a genuinely remarkable life behind her. As a small girl of no more than 8 years old, she had been sent away eastward into the empire to be the bride of the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry V, a match of the very highest standing that Christendom could offer. She had grown up in Germany, had been crowned, and had shared in some real measure in the government of imperial lands, had learned from girlhood to carry herself as an empress in the greatest court of the Western world. Men would call her the Empress ever afterward, all her life long, and she wore the title as a settled part of her very self. But her husband the Emperor died while she was still young, and left her without children of that marriage. And so, in 1125, she came back at last to her father's court, a widow of imposing rank and of no clear future at all, an empress now without an empire to rule. Her return home changed everything, though it took the drowning of her brother and the barrenness of her stepmother together to make it so, for here quite suddenly was the one thing that Henry now most lacked and could not otherwise get for himself. A lawful child of his own body, fully grown, proven, and of the very highest dignity in all of Christendom. If Adeliza would give him no son, then Matilda was what remained to him. And so the old king made a bold decision, and one that was, for that age, very nearly unheard of. He resolved to make his own daughter his heir, to leave both England and Normandy to a woman, and to bind his great barons by a solemn oath to accept her as their lady and their ruler. At his Christmas court in 1126, and again more formally in the opening days of 1127, he gathered the great men of the realm and had them swear to uphold Matilda as his rightful successor, should he chance to die without a lawful son of his body. The oath was duly sworn by the bishops and the earls and the barons, by Matilda's own half-brother Robert of Gloucester, and, not least, by a man named Stephen of Blois, the king's own nephew, who swore that day as readily and as loudly as any man there, and who would go on to break his sworn oath faster than any of them, when at last the day came to keep it. It is worth pausing to feel how strange and how fragile this whole arrangement truly was, for it explains the ruin that came after. No woman had ever yet ruled England in her own right. The very idea of it sat deeply uneasy with the hard-fighting men who swore to uphold it, many of whom, we may be quite sure, swore the words with their lips while their minds ran already upon other and better possibilities. A queen who bore and raised up heirs was one thing entirely, a familiar and an honoured thing. But a queen who ruled, who led armies into the field and gave binding judgment in the courts, and commanded the loyalty of proud and violent lords, was quite another matter altogether, and wholly untried in that land. Henry knew the difficulty of it well, and he tried to guard against it. He married Matilda again, to strengthen her hand for the fight he half foresaw, this time to Geoffrey, the young heir of Anjou, a match that joined her to a powerful southern house, and might, given time, give her sons to carry the line forward. And indeed she would in time bear sons by Geoffrey, one of whom, another Henry, would one day be a truly great king of England in his own right. But all of that lay far off in the unseen future. For now, there was only an old king, a designated daughter whom many would not gladly follow, a nervous and mistrustful baronage bound by an oath they had no love for, and a watching nephew named Stephen, waiting quietly upon events. We should understand clearly why the oath sat so ill with the men who swore it. For their unease was not mere prejudice, though there was prejudice in it. The trouble was partly the plain novelty of a woman ruling in her own right, which no man there had ever seen and few could imagine working. But it was sharpened by a second thing, which was Matilda's second marriage. For to strengthen her, Henry had married her to Geoffrey of Anjou, and the house of Anjou was the old and bitter enemy of Normandy, a neighbour the Norman lords had fought for generations. To swear to accept Matilda was, in the eyes of many a Norman baron, to swear to accept the hated Angevin as the power behind her, for a husband in that age ruled his wife, and a queen's husband would rule her realm. The barons had sworn to a woman, and behind the woman they saw the shadow of Anjou, and it turned their stomachs. Worse, the king had not even asked their leave before making the Angevin match, or so some of them grumbled afterward, and a few would later claim that their oath had been given only on the understanding that Matilda would not be married outside the realm without their counsel, and that the marriage to Geoffrey had freed them from it. This was very likely an excuse dressed up as a principle, the kind of argument men reach for when they have already decided to do what suits them. But it shows how brittle the whole arrangement was, how little true weight the oath carried once the strong hand that had compelled it was gone. Henry had built his succession upon a promise, and a promise is only as good as the will of those who make it. He seems, in his last years, to have half seen the danger, for he quarrelled with Matilda and Geoffrey over the border castles of Normandy at the very end, and died with that quarrel unhealed. The old king had done everything that policy could do, and it was not enough, and some part of him may have known it as he lay dying over his dish of lampreys in the Norman autumn. And where, in all of this high politics, was Adeliza? She was the queen still, the wife whose very childlessness had made the whole precarious arrangement necessary in the first place. And she stood quietly by, while another woman, her own stepdaughter, and very near her own age, was raised up into the place that her own body had not been able to fill. We do not hear of any open quarrel between the two women, and the later course of both their lives suggests something a good deal better than quarrel. For when the wars finally came, Adeliza would show Matilda a kindness that cost her dearly and risked everything she had. But it cannot have been a simple or an easy thing to be the barren queen standing beside the designated heir, to know that your own failure had lifted her up into that high place, to watch the whole succession of the kingdom being carefully arranged around the empty space where your son should have been. Adeliza seems to have borne it, as she bore everything else that was laid upon her, with grace and without complaint. But we should not imagine that the last years of the reign were easy ones for her. The court in the final decade of Henry's rule was a time of held breath, waiting upon an old man's death and quietly dreading what would surely follow it, and the queen lived at the very centre of that waiting, both its cause and its daily witness. So the first great phase of her life drew slowly toward its close, the long phase in which she was Henry's crowned queen. She had come across the sea a frightened girl, been crowned and anointed the lady of a realm, kept a large household and a small court of letters, borne the long private sorrow of her childlessness. and watched the kingdom arrange its whole future around another woman entirely. And through the greater part of it she had been at her husband's side, not only in England, but across the water in Normandy as well. For Henry's rule was always a rule of two lands held together, and the Queen went where the King went. Before we come to his death, which ended this whole first chapter of her life, let us follow the two of them across the Channel, into the other half of the King's restless world, and see the Queen in Normandy. For it rounds out the picture of these married years, and it was in Normandy, in the end, that the old King died. Henry was quite as much the Duke of Normandy as he was the King of England, and perhaps a good deal more at home in the one role than in the other. For Normandy was the land of his fathers, the duchy that the conqueror had held and ruled long before ever he crossed the water to take England by the sword. A great part of Henry's reign was spent over there, holding the duchy secure against the constant pressure of its neighbours, and above all against the King of France, who was the Duke's overlord in name and his sharp rival in plain fact, and against the Counts of Anjou to the south, whom Henry by turns fought hard and married into. The narrow sea was never a wall shutting off this world, but rather a busy road running through the middle of it, crossed and recrossed without end by the royal court, as the tangled business of the two lands required. And the Queen crossed that road along with him far more often than many a royal wife of that age, for Henry seems to have wished to keep Adeliza near to him, and the surviving record shows her at his side on both shores of the water through the years of their marriage. Think of what that seafaring life must have been for her, who had first come to England over that same stretch of water with the wreck of the White Ship still fresh in every mind on both shores. Crossing was never a small thing. It was a day and a night together, spent wholly at the mercy of the wind and the tide in a small wooden ship, upon a sea that had already shown, within her own living memory, exactly what it was capable of doing to the very greatest in the land. Every single passage she made carried the near ghost of that other passage somewhere within it. And yet she made them again and again, following the King's restless rule from the palaces of England to the grey stone castles of Normandy and home again, keeping her whole household together across the salt miles, at home as ever. Only wherever her own hangings were hung upon the walls and her own chapel set up for prayer, and nowhere for very long. The Queen in Normandy was the very same Queen she had been in England, busy and dutiful and cultivated and childless and honoured. But she was further still from the country of her own birth, out on the very outermost edge of the Norman world, with the lands of France and of Anjou pressing hard and close about it, in the duchy where the old King was most fully himself, and where his long life would, at the last run, finally out. The two lands that Adeliza's husband ruled were bound together and held apart by the same narrow sea, and the whole rhythm of the reign was set by the crossing of it. On the Norman side lay Rouen, the great city on the Seine that was the true heart of the duchy, rich with trade and thick with the churches and the castles of the Norman lords. Around it lay a duchy that was never wholly at peace, pressed on the east by the lands of the King of France, who was overlord to the Norman Duke in name and his rival in every deed, and pressed on the south by the Counts of Anjou. The border country, the debated castles and the marches, was a place of constant small war and shifting loyalty, and Henry spent much of his strength and much of his gold holding it, to pass between his two realms. The King and all his people had to trust themselves to the water, and the water was not to be trusted lightly. The ports of the Norman shore, Barfleur among them, looked across to the harbours of England, and between lay a passage that could be swift and easy on a fair day, and deadly on a foul one, as the whole world had learned from the White Ship. Ships were small, and the sea was strong, and there were seasons when no wise man crossed at all. For Adeliza, who followed the court back and forth across that water season upon season, the sea was simply a fact of her life, a thing to be braved again and again, in cold and in dark and in the memory of disaster. She crossed it as a bride and as a queen, and would cross it once more at the very end of her life, going the other way, home. The narrow sea runs through her whole story like a grey thread, joining Brabant to England, and England to Normandy, the road she was carried along by every turn of her fortune, and never once, in all her long life, quite at rest from it. The last years of Henry's reign had about them the feeling of a long winter afternoon, the light going down slowly and by degrees, the shadows stretching further across the floor. Everyone in the house quietly aware that the day was near its end, though no one could name the very hour of it. The king was truly old now, in his middle 60s, which was a great age indeed for a man of that time. And though he still ruled with all the same close and unsleeping attention to his revenues and his justice, the whole court could plainly see that the reign was drawing on toward its close. And because the whole succession now rested upon an oath that so many had sworn so unwillingly, the slow approach of the king's death was not a simple grief, but a gathering unease that touched everyone. Men looked at Matilda, far off now in Anjou, and quarrelling by this time with her own father over lands and castles along the border, and then they looked at Stephen of Blois, close at hand, easy and open-handed and well-liked by all, and they made their own private reckonings of just where their advantage would come to lie when the old king was finally gone. For the peace of Henry's long reign, real and solid as it plainly was, had always been the peace of one strong hand upon the reins, and every man in the kingdom knew it in his heart. There was no settled machinery of state that could carry the realm safely through a disputed succession. There was only the king, and the king's own iron grip, and the oath sworn to his daughter. Take away that one man, and the grip failed of itself, and the oath was worth only as much as the honour of the men who had sworn it, which was, as events would prove, not worth a good deal at all. So the last years were shadowed everywhere by the one question that no one could answer, of what exactly would happen on the day that Henry died, and the Queen lived at the very heart of that unanswerable question, though she had no power whatever to settle it. She was the childless wife whose barrenness had first made the doubt, the stepmother of the contested heir, the lady of a court that was already quietly and behind its hands, beginning to choose its sides while its old master yet lived and breathed. It cannot have been a restful or an easy time for her. Through all of it, Adeliza kept her steady place at the king's side. There is a real steadiness in her that comes through even the thin and broken record we have. A woman who simply did what her high station required of her, without complaint, season upon season, through disappointment and unease alike. And she was still young, we should keep firmly in mind, not much past 30 even now. A woman who had given the whole flower of her youth to an old man and a hard duty, and had nothing of her own to show for any of it. No child, no settled future of her own, nothing but the crown that would slip from her head the very moment that her husband breathed his last. What did she hope for in those closing years of the reign? We cannot know it. But she was plainly not a woman to sit idle in self-pity, and the full life that she built for herself after Henry's death strongly suggests someone who kept, all through the long grey waiting, a real capacity for a fuller and a happier existence than the one that policy had first handed her. For now, though, she waited along with all the rest, as the old king's long winter drew on toward its dark, and the end, when it came at last, came suddenly, in Normandy, and over a dish of food that he had been plainly warned not to touch. The story of Henry's death is one of those small and human tales that fasten themselves forever to the great turning events of history. He was in Normandy in the autumn of 1135, and he went out hunting in the forest, an old man still keeping stubbornly to the pleasures of his lost vigour. Afterward, at his supper, he ate heartily of lampreys, a rich and oily eel-like fish, of which he had always been very fond, and which his own physicians had warned him again and again against eating, for they did not agree with his aged body. He would not be told, and he would not be ruled, not even in this. He ate his fill of them, and that same night he fell ill, and the illness deepened steadily over the following days, until it grew plain to all about him that the old king was dying at last. He lingered about a week, time enough to make his confession to the church, and to give what few directions he still could, and then, at the very beginning of December, upon the Norman soil of his fathers, King Henry, the youngest son of the great conqueror, the hard scholar king who had held 2 lands in one fist for 35 years, died. The grip that had held all England quiet for a whole generation was gone from the world. For Adeliza, the king's death was the sudden end of the only life that she had ever known as a grown woman. She had been a wife and a crowned queen since she was a girl of not yet 20, and now, at some 32 years of age, she was neither the one nor the other. A widowed queen held an honoured but a deeply uncertain place in that world. She kept her dower lands, the rich estates that had been settled upon her at the time of her marriage, and these made her a genuinely wealthy woman in her own right, and she kept, too, the dignity and the honour of a former queen. But she had no husband now, no child of her own, no throne, and no clear part left to play in the great storm that was even then about to break over the whole kingdom. Her entire reason for being in England at all, the giving of an heir, had come to nothing in the end, and the man who had brought her there was dead, and soon to be in his tomb. What was she now to do? Where was she now to go? These were real and pressing questions for a young widow of the very greatest rank. No settled future, and it would take her some few years yet to find their answers. The dealing with a dead king's body was itself a hard and a solemn business, and Henry's was harder than most. He had died in Normandy, but wished to lie in England, and so his body had to be made ready for a long journey by land and sea in the cold heart of winter. In the way of that age the king was opened, and his inward parts taken out and buried in Norman ground, at Rouen, while the body itself was salted and wrapped close in hides to preserve it for the crossing. Even so, the chroniclers tell us, the work was ill done, and the corpse of the great king gave off so foul a savour that those who tended it suffered for their duty. A grim last humbling of a man who had held 2 lands in terror of him. There is a hard lesson buried in it, of the kind the preachers loved, that the mightiest flesh comes in the end to the same corruption as the meanest, and that no crown holds off the grave. The body was carried at last across the sea and brought to Reading, to the great abbey that Henry had raised and endowed for exactly this. And there it was laid before the high altar with all the ceremony that a dead king was owed. Whether Adeliza followed it to its grave we are not told, but her care for the place and for the soul of the man laid in it in all the years that followed suggests a widow who did not turn lightly away from her husband's tomb. The old man who had sent across Europe for a young bride to mend his house was in the ground, his great work of succession already unravelling above him, and the girl he had fetched from Brabant stood on the far side of her first life, a widow of 32, free now for the first time since her girlhood, to wonder what she herself might want. It would take her a little while to find the answer, but the answer, when it came, would be a good one. Her first care, and it does her real credit, was for the old king himself, for his body and for his soul. Henry had wished to be buried in England, at the Abbey of Reading, which he had founded and richly endowed, and clearly meant from the first as his own resting place. His body was carried the long way from Normandy, across the sea to Reading, and laid there in the ground he had chosen. and in the years that followed, Adeliza gave generously for the good of his soul, endowing prayers and masses for the dead king, remembering the husband whose barren queen she had been, with a steady care that speaks very well of the marriage, whatever its private sorrows had been. A woman who had been ill-used, or who had come to hate her husband in life, does not spend the years of her widowhood enriching the abbey where he lies, and paying for the singing of masses for his soul season upon season. Adeliza's careful tending of Henry's memory is one of the quiet proofs we have that theirs, for all its long disappointment, had been in truth a marriage of real and mutual regard. But the wider world would not hold still and wait upon her mourning. Even as Henry was being carried to his tomb at Reading, the careful succession that he had laboured so long to secure was already coming apart at every seam. Matilda, the sworn and designated heir, was away in Anjou, at bitter odds with her dying father at the very last, and she was slow to move when speed was everything. Stephen of Blois, the nephew who had sworn the oath more loudly than any man, was quick precisely where she was slow. He crossed the sea at once to England, went straight to London and then to Winchester, laid his hands upon the royal treasury and the crown, and had himself made an anointed king before Matilda had so much as stirred from Anjou, in the very same way that Henry himself had once seized his own throne upon the sudden death of a brother. The great oath was broken. The barons who had sworn so solemnly to uphold Matilda now accepted Stephen instead, some of them gladly, some only for want of any better course. And for a time it seemed the whole theft would simply hold. But Matilda was not a woman to give up quietly a crown that had been promised to her before God, and behind her there stood her formidable half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, and a whole party of men who held still to the old king's dying wish. The seed of a civil war was sown in that hurried and stolen coronation, and it would grow, in the years to come, into the long and terrible conflict that the later ages would remember and name, quite simply, the Anarchy. Into that gathering storm, Adeliza the widow now had to find her own way forward, and the way that she first chose might have surprised even herself. She withdrew for a time from the whole clamorous world into the deep quiet of religion. For a widow of high rank in that age, the cloister was a natural and an honourable refuge, and Adeliza took it, at least for a season of her life. She withdrew to Wilton, an ancient and a noble abbey of nuns near Salisbury, a house long favoured by royal and high-born women who sought either a lasting retirement from the world or only a shelter within its walls, while they decided quietly what to do next with their lives. It was not, for her, a taking of vows. She did not become a nun and did not bind herself for life. But she lodged there in the way that great ladies did, within the abbey's ordered peace, among its women and its prayers and its quiet regular days, while the kingdom outside its walls began to tear itself slowly to pieces over the crown. We can well imagine the appeal that it held for her just then. She had spent 14 years at the very centre of power, moving without rest with a restless court, watched at every hour by a whole kingdom, carrying always the weight of a hope that she could not fulfill. And now, quite suddenly, none of that was hers any longer. And Wilton offered her a place to set the whole weight down at last, and simply be still, picture the abbey and its slow round of days, so utterly unlike the noisy court she had left behind her. The bells that called the nuns to their prayers, through all the hours of the day and the night, the plain-song rising and falling in the cold church, the covered cloister walk where the black-veiled women paced and told their beads, the deep quiet of the refectory at meat and of the long dormitory at night. For a woman who had lived so long amid the noise and the endless display of a royal household, it must have been a strange and, for a while at least, a genuinely healing quiet. Here she could mourn her husband properly and at her own pace, and pray for the repose of his soul, and slowly gather up the scattered pieces of herself. Here she was among women once again, as she had been in her own chambers as a queen, but women now given over wholly to God, whose days had a shape and a purpose that owed nothing at all to the turning of policy or the counting of the months. Wilton was a place in which to breathe again, and to think, and to decide. For a young widow could not stay forever in a nunnery unless she truly meant to take the veil and give up the world. And Adeliza, as it turned out, did not mean any such thing. There was a fitness in her choosing Wilton of all houses, for it had long been a place where royal and noble ladies went, whether to be schooled as girls, or to shelter for a season, or to end their days in religion. It was one of the great old nunneries of the land, rich and dignified, with a tradition that reached back into the English past before the conquest, and it had a particular tie to queens. Henry's own first wife, the good Queen Matilda, whose place Adeliza had taken, had spent part of her girlhood being brought up in just such a house among the veiled women, and had nearly been kept from her royal marriage by the question of whether she had taken the veil herself. Wilton knew how to receive a great lady, how to give her the shelter and the honour her rank required, without demanding that she surrender the world for good. So Adeliza came, in her widowhood, into a house well used to ladies exactly like her. Women sat down suddenly between one life and the next, and needing a quiet corner to stand while they found the shape of what came after. She was not the first queen or the last to seek that shelter within those walls. And the round of the abbey, the prayers and the plain song, and the ordered days would have done for her what it had done for many before her, held her steady through a hard passage, given her grief somewhere to rest, and left her free, when she was ready, to choose again. That she did choose again, and chose life and marriage and children over the veil, takes nothing from the shelter that Wilton gave her in the meantime. It was the pause between her two lives, the still place where the queen laid down her crown for good, and the countess was not yet made, and she seems to have known exactly what she needed of it, and taken that, and no more. For she was still young, and rich in her dower lands, and by no means finished yet with the world and its life. A widowed queen of 32 years, well-born, wealthy, and of thoroughly good report, was a considerable prize in the hard marriage market of that age, and she cannot have wanted for interest in her hand. But what happened next is the very thing that lifts Adeliza's story clean up out of the ordinary run and gives it all its warmth, for her second marriage was not, so far as we can possibly tell, a match of cold policy at all. It seems instead to have been something a good deal rarer and finer, a match that she made largely for herself, out of affection, a marriage of the heart in an age when great women were so seldom allowed one. She had done her hard duty by policy once already, giving the whole flower of her youth to an old king for the sake of an alliance and a hoped-for heir. The second time around, it appears, she pleased herself instead, and in pleasing herself, she found at last the ordinary human happiness that her first marriage, for all its high honour and its splendour, had never once given her. The man whom she chose, or who was at the least chosen along with her, and by her own free will, was William d'Aubigny, a nobleman of the English court, a younger man than she was by some reckoning, a vigorous and a rising man, but not, at the time that the marriage was first made, anywhere near her equal in rank or in dignity. He was no king, and no duke, and no great earl of ancient line. He was a lord of good, but not of exalted family, a man whose own father had served the crown in the honoured but distinctly practical office of the king's butler, and whose personal fortune was still very much to be made in the world. For a former Queen of England to marry so far down below the great station that she had once held was, by the hard unspoken rules of that world, a real stepping down. And yet she did it, within only a few years of Henry's death, and everything about the marriage that followed after suggests that she never once had the smallest cause to regret it. This was not a woman being sold a second time into the service of policy. This was a woman who, having at last earned the right to choose, chose for herself a man that she wanted, and made with him the full and fruitful and settled life that had been so long denied her. And William, for his own part, rose swiftly on the strength of the great match, as a man well might who had married a queen. Whatever he had been before it, he was now the husband of the late king's widow, a woman of royal dignity and of rich and broad lands, and the honours came to him accordingly. He was made an earl, the lord of Arundel and of its castle down in Sussex, and took his place among the higher nobility of the realm. The butler's son had married a queen and become an earl, and the queen who had borne no living child to a king was now, in her middle 30s, about to become the mother of a large and a thriving family. A tale grew up in later years about William d'Aubigny, and though it is legend rather than sober history, it is worth the telling, for it shows the kind of man that men believed him to be. The story went that before his marriage to Adeliza, William had travelled to France, and there so dazzled the widowed queen of that country with his skill and his bearing at a great tournament, that she offered him her hand and her love. William, the tale said, refused her, for his heart was set elsewhere, and the spurned queen in her anger contrived to have him shut in a garden with a starving lion, meaning it to be the death of him. But William, undismayed, thrust his arm down the beast's throat and tore out its tongue by the roots, and so killed the lion with his bare hands and walked out alive. Ever after, the story ran, he bore a lion in his arms and was called William Stronghand, and the Lion of Arundel came down from that day. We need not believe a word of it, and it is very likely that the Lion of the d'Aubigny arms came from some soberer source, and the tale was spun afterward to explain it. But legends of this kind do not attach themselves to grey and forgettable men. They attach to the vivid ones, the men who caught the imagination of their age, and William d'Aubigny plainly did. He was famed in his own day as a warrior and a man of the tournament, a figure of dash and strength, and it is not hard to see why a Queen Dowager of England, free at last to please herself, might have chosen such a man over the safe grey lords that policy would have picked for her. He proved, moreover, a solid and a capable husband and lord. Not merely a tournament champion, he built and he governed and he founded houses of religion alongside his wife, raised a great castle of his own in Norfolk to add to Arundel in the south, and served the crown steadily through hard and shifting times. Adeliza had chosen well, by her heart and by her head together, and the long contentment of the marriage was her reward. There is a point worth drawing out here about widows, for it is the key to how Adeliza came to have any choice at all. A maiden of great birth had no say in her marriage whatever, as we have seen. But a widow stood on quite different ground. Having been married once, and having done her duty by it, a widow of rank held lands and rights in her own hands, and with them a measure of freedom that no unmarried girl possessed. She could, within limits, have some voice in whether and whom she married again. The limits were real, to be sure, and for a woman as great as a former queen, the chief of them was that the reigning king had an interest in so wealthy a widow and her lands, and his leave would be needed before she could remarry. Adeliza would have required that leave, and evidently obtained it, for the match went forward. But within those limits, she chose, and that is the remarkable thing. She was not handed to William d'Aubigny by a father driving a bargain, as she had been handed to Henry. She came to him as a woman, grown, widowed, wealthy, and in some real degree her own, and the marriage has every look of a thing she wanted, rather than a thing done to her. That is why it stands out so. in a record full of women married where policy pointed. Here, for once, we seem to see a great lady of the 12th century pleasing herself in the one matter that most shaped a woman's life, and being rewarded for it with years of contentment and a house full of children. It does not happen often in these old stories, and when it does, it is worth marking. And Adeliza's second marriage is one of the clearest and happiest instances of it that the whole age affords. It is one of the happier turns in all of this long history, and it deserves to be dwelt upon, for so much of Adeliza's earlier life had been given over to duty and to disappointment. And here, at last, near the middle of her days, was something that looks very much like plain joy. From the cold splendour of her first marriage, she passed now into the settled warmth of her second. And the very centre of that warmth was a castle down in Sussex, standing upon a hill above a winding river, and it is there that we go next, to Arundel, which became her home and her happiness for the whole rest of her years in England. Arundel Castle stands upon a rise of ground in the south of Sussex, above the river Arun, which winds its slow way down through the water meadows to the open sea, not so many miles off. It was already an old and a strong fortress when Adeliza first came to it as its lady, a great raised mound crowned with a keep of stone, with its walls and its hall and all the works of a chief baronial seat, set there to guard the crossing of the river and the road that ran inland from the coast. This place became her home. After the endless restless travelling of her years as a queen, and after the abbey quiet of her early widowhood, she settled here at last, the lady of a great castle in the soft green rolling country of the south, and it was here that the fullest and the happiest chapter of her whole life was lived out. There is something deeply fitting in it, when you stop to consider. The girl from the flat, watered, patient country of Brabant ended her English years in another gentle country of slow rivers and green meadows, not so very unlike the one that she had been born into, and mistress now, at long last, of a house that was truly and wholly her own. Let us stand a while in that place and in that life, for it is the reward of the whole story, and we have fairly earned it together by coming so far. Arundel in the years of her marriage to William would have been a full and a busy household, but a household of an altogether different temper from the great royal court that she had known before. Here she was, not the barren queen, watched and counted by a whole anxious kingdom, but simply the lady of the house, the wife of its lord, and, before very long at all, the mother of its children. The castle above the Arun, with its hall and its chapel and its private chambers, its stores and its stables and its walled gardens, its many people high and low, was a small and complete world with Adeliza set at the very centre of it. And she ruled over it now not as a queen rules a distant realm through officers and writs, but as a great lady rules her own house directly and with her own hands, which is a warmer and a far nearer kind of ruling. The river running below the walls, the downs rolling away green toward the distant sea, the mild, soft southern weather, so unlike the hard winters of the north, the steady coming and going of the household's year, seed time and haymaking and harvest and the great feasts of the church, all of it together made the frame of a settled and a contented life. The very settled life that she had never once had while she wore a crown upon her head. Arundel was no ordinary castle, but the head of an entire lordship, and it is worth knowing what William d'Aubigny's earldom actually was. The county of Sussex was divided, in a fashion peculiar to that shire, into long strips running from the sea up into the wooded weald, and each of these strips was called a rape, and each had at its head a strong castle guarding a river valley. Arundel was the castle at the head of one of these rapes, set exactly where the river Arun cuts its way through the great chalk ridge of the South Downs on its road to the sea. It was a place of real strategic weight, holding the gap in the hills and the crossing of the river and the way inland from the coast. Which is why a castle had stood there since the Conqueror's day, and why it was worth an earldom to hold it. To be Lady of Arundel, then, was to be mistress not merely of a fine house, but of a whole reach of country. Its farms and its villages, its woods and its downland pastures, its little port and its market, the people who worked the land and owed their service to the castle on the hill. The green country about it was and is among the gentlest in England, the smooth downs rising behind, the water meadows spreading below, the sea, a soft presence a few miles off. After the flat-watered country of her birth and the hard travelling of her queenship, Adeliza came to rest in a landscape that was kind, and in a house that was strong, and in a lordship wide enough to occupy a great lady's whole care. The castle she knew has been much changed by the long centuries since, rebuilt and grand, but the hill it stands on, and the gap it guards, and the river below are the same. And it is not hard, standing there, in the mind's eye, to see why the place became for her the settled home that no palace had ever been. And into that life, season upon season, came the children that the first marriage had never given her, until the castle up above the Arun was fairly full of them. The children came, and there were a good many of them, where 14 years spent with a king had brought her not one single living child. A handful of years with William d'Aubigny brought her a whole family. 7 children, by the fullest count that has come down to us across the centuries. Sons and daughters both, who grew up and married in their turn, and carried her blood forward into the noble houses of England for many generations to come. The exact number and the birth order of them is not perfectly certain to us now, for the records of such domestic things are worn and imperfect, and you will find the tally given a little differently in different places by careful writers. But the broad and central fact of it is plain, and it is a happy one to hold. The barren queen had become the fruitful countess, the woman whose empty cradle had helped, without her ever wishing it, to set a civil war in motion, now filled a nursery at Arundel with the healthy children of her own free choosing. Her children by William d'Aubigny carried her blood far down the centuries into the very heart of the English nobility. Her eldest son followed his father as Earl of Arundel and held the great castle above the Arun after them. And through him and his brothers and sisters, the line ran on and mingled with house after house, so that in time a good part of the English aristocracy could trace some thread of descent back to the fair Queen of Brabant and her tournament champion. The barren years with the king had left no mark on the world at all, no child, no line. The fruitful years with the earl left a posterity that spread like a river reaching its delta, wide and branching and long enduring. And she drew her own family after her across the sea, as great ladies often did. Her brother, Jocelyn of Louvain, came over from Brabant to England, and Adeliza saw him settled there with lands of his own, granting him the honour of Petworth in her own county of Sussex, not far from Arundel. Jocelyn married an English heiress of the northern house of Percy, and took up that great name, and from that union sprang the long and mighty line of the Percys, the lords and later the Earls of Northumberland. The fierce border dynasty that would fill the chronicles of England for centuries with their wars and their risings and their pride. So it happened that the girl from the hall on the Digel became, through her brother whom she planted in England, an ancestress of one of the greatest of all the northern families, and through her own children an ancestress of half the south besides. She who had been thought barren became, in the end, a fountainhead. There is a quiet justice in that, and it is worth remembering when we think of the long sorrow of her first marriage, that the blood which the old king could not draw from her flowed out at last, abundantly, into the whole future of the land she had married into. There is a real poignancy folded into this, and it is worth sitting quietly with for a moment, for it tells us something true and something a little sorrowful about her first marriage, and about the whole age that she lived in. The failure to bear an heir to King Henry had been laid, as such failures were always laid in that world, entirely at the Queen's own door. For it was ever the woman who was blamed and pitied and prayed over when a royal marriage proved barren, and never the man. Yet here now was the plain and living proof, written out in a whole houseful of thriving children, that the fault had never in truth been hers at all. Her body could bear children, and bear them abundantly and safely. The childlessness of her years as a queen had lain instead with the aging king, or else with some mystery of the two of them together that no physician of the time could name or mend, but not with any barrenness in her. How she must have felt, holding her own children in her arms at last, after all those long-watched and hoping and disappointed years, we can only try to imagine, but it is not at all hard to imagine a deep gladness in it, and perhaps, too, a quiet sense of her own vindication, and perhaps, now and then, a passing thought for the son that she had never been able to give the old king who lay now in his tomb at Reading. So the middle years of her life at Arundel were full ones, and good ones. A great lady in her own castle, surrounded by her own growing family, honoured by her neighbours, wealthy in her lands, and settled and content in her days. She did not forget the wider world beyond her walls, nor her older ties and connections. She kept up her careful tending of Henry's memory, her endowments and her masses for the good of his soul. She kept, too, her ties of blood to her own family across the sea in Brabant, and her old interest in the church and in the making and the giving of fine books that had marked her out from the very first days of her time in England. Hers was now the rounded and complete life of a great noblewoman, with all its duties and all its comforts, lived out in the soft green country of the English south. It might well have gone on so, quietly and happily, all the way to its own natural end, and left her only a small and pleasant footnote in the histories. The fair foreign queen who married twice and bore many children and endowed a few abbeys. But the wider storm that had been gathering over the kingdom ever since Henry's death now reached even the peace of Arundel, and it brought Adeliza her single most famous hour, the hour in which she opened her castle gate to the woman who would have been queen, and stood, for a few genuinely dangerous days, at the very centre of the war for the crown of England. For while Adeliza had been quietly building her happy life at Arundel, the great quarrel over the succession had grown into open war across the land. Stephen, who had seized the crown so swiftly, wore it still, but his hold upon it was never once secure, and against him stood the whole party of the Empress Matilda, who had never for a moment given up her claim to what had been sworn to her. And in 1139, some 4 years after her father's death, Matilda at last resolved to come to England in her own person, to make good her right by force of arms. She crossed the sea and landed upon the southern coast, come at last to claim the kingdom that had been promised to her before God and the barons, and she came, of all the places in England that she might have gone to Arundel, for Adeliza, the widow of Matilda's own father, the old king, received her there and gave her shelter within the strong walls of the castle above the Arundel. Think hard of what that act of shelter truly meant, and of what it might so easily have cost her. Adeliza was married now to William d'Aubigny, and William was, at least in name and in his formal allegiance, a man of King Stephen's peace, holding his earldom and his castle under the king, who actually reigned and sat upon the throne. To open the gate of Arundel to Matilda, to Stephen's chief rival come in arms to take his very crown, was to shelter the declared enemy of the reigning king beneath her own roof, a thing that could readily be named as treason, a thing that put her and her husband and her whole newly built happiness into real and immediate danger. And yet she did it. whether she did it out of loyalty to the memory of Henry, her husband, whose dying wish had been that Matilda should reign after him, or out of simple family feeling for the woman who was, after all, her own stepdaughter, or out of the plain and sacred obligations of hospitality to a great lady arrived, weary at her gate, or out of some quiet mingling of all three. Adeliza took Matilda in. It is the boldest act that we know of in her whole life, and it is all the more striking for coming from a woman whose life had otherwise been one of duty and of quiet. When the one moment came that truly asked her for courage, she reached down and found it. But the sheltering of such a guest could not long stay a secret, and it did not for a moment stay safe. Word ran swiftly to King Stephen that his great rival had landed and was now lodged behind the walls of Arundel. And Stephen did the thing that very nearly any king in his place would have done. He came with an army and laid siege to the castle, meaning to take the Empress before ever she could join with her supporters and raise the whole country against him. And so Adeliza found herself, quite suddenly, in the very worst position of her entire life, a woman who had taken in a guest out of duty or of kindness, and who now found herself shut up within her own home along with that guest, while the crowned monarch of the land sat outside her walls with an army at his back, and her husband's loyalty, her own safety, and the whole fortune of her young family hung together in the balance. The peace of Arundel was broken by the trumpets of a royal siege, and the fair foreign queen, who had wanted nothing more than her own quiet days among her children, was caught fast at the very hinge of the war for England. It helps to understand why she chose that moment, and why she made for that particular castle. For 3 years the Empress had pressed her cause only from afar, through her friends and through the courts of the church. But she had not dared to set foot in the country in her own right. What changed was her half-brother, Robert of Gloucester, the old king's most powerful natural son, the man who had sworn most weightily to uphold her, at last threw off his allegiance and declared openly for his sister. With so great a lord now at her back, she had, for the first time, a following large enough to fight for. And when at last she made her move, Robert did not stay beside her. He rode on inland toward the west, to the loyal city of Bristol, to raise her banner among her strongest friends, while she turned aside to her stepmother's house for rest and shelter. That parting of the two, the brother going one way and the sister another, would come to matter far more than either of them could then have guessed. Why Arundel? Because it was safe ground, or should have been, the house of the old king's widow, a place where the Empress might rest and gather herself before the storm. Adeliza was the natural person to receive her, bound to her by the memory of Henry and by the ties of a shared past at his court. But safe ground it proved not to be. For Robert's going on to Bristol left Matilda exposed at Arundel just as word of the landing reached the king, and Stephen moved fast. So the Empress found herself, almost at the moment of her arrival, penned in her stepmother's castle with the king's army closing on the roads, her great venture in danger of ending before it had begun, and Adeliza caught up with her, host to the hunted, at the very centre of a war she had never sought a place in. The whole future of the crown hung, for those few days, on what would happen at that castle gate above the Arun. The siege of Arundel was a short one, as such things were reckoned, but for the few days that it lasted, it held the whole war balanced upon a knife, and it set Adeliza in a corner that would have broken a weaker nerve than hers. Outside the walls sat King Stephen with his army, come to take the Empress and end the challenge to his crown at a single stroke. Inside the walls sat Matilda, the rival claimant to the throne, and with her the widow of the old king who had taken her in. Stephen had every hard reason in the world to press the siege home. If he could only seize Matilda now, here at the very beginning of her bid, before ever she reached her strong supporters away in the west, then the whole war might be over almost before it had truly begun. The prize was the crown of England itself, and it lay there for the taking, just behind Adeliza's gate. We can furnish the scene readily enough from what such sieges were. The castle shut up tight, its gates barred, and its bridge drawn. The household within it set upon short rations and shorter tempers. The men-at-arms standing watch upon the walls, and looking down at the enemy's camp, spread out below them. And beyond, at the foot of the hill, the tents and the bright banners of the king's whole host. The smoke of their many cook fires rising into the Sussex sky, the slow, deliberate movement of armed men about the base of the castle mound, the patient and unhurried menace of an army settling itself in to wait a garrison out. And within the castle, at the very heart of it all, the two women upon whom everything now turned, the Empress who had come so far and dared so much to claim a kingdom, and now found herself trapped almost at the very moment of her landing, and the widow whose open-handed hospitality had brought this whole deadly danger down upon her own head and her own house. It was a hard place indeed for Adeliza. Her husband William was, by his sworn allegiance, Stephen's man, and here was his wife giving shelter to Stephen's mortal enemy. Her lands, her family, her very life might all be forfeit if the thing should go wrong. She had acted from duty or from kindness, and duty and kindness had led her straight into deadly peril. Live for a moment inside those few days, for they were surely the longest of her life. A castle under siege is a world turned in upon itself, its gates barred, its people shut within the walls with the enemy in plain sight below, every ordinary certainty of life suddenly in question. The stores must be reckoned and guarded, for no more will come in while the army sits outside. The men on the walls must be kept steady, watching the king's host at the foot of the hill, and wondering, as everyone within wondered, whether it would come to an assault, and what would follow if the defences were carried. And through it, all the lady of the house had to hold her household together, to keep fear from becoming panic. To be seen to be calm, whether she felt calm or not. For a great house takes its temper from its mistress, and hers were watching her. And she carried, beyond the ordinary dread of any besieged garrison, a particular and a personal danger. This was her doing. She had brought this army to her own gate by the choice she had made, and if it went wrong, it was not only her walls that would fall, but her whole future that would be forfeit, her lands, her husband's standing, perhaps her freedom or worse. The guest she sheltered was the cause of it all, the Empress in her chamber, for whose sake the king sat outside with his siege. Two women then, waiting together through those days behind the barred gate, the one who had come to take a kingdom and the one who had taken her in, while the fate of both hung on the mood of the king below and the counsel of his advisers. It is no wonder that the age remembered the episode, for it had everything: a hunted heir, a bold hostess, a royal army, and a castle gate that might open onto ruin or onto rescue. That Adeliza came through it with her nerve intact and her house unbroken is the measure of her, and it is the moment above all others by which she earned her small, bright place in the great chronicle of that war. What happened next was one of the strangest turns of that whole strange and pitiless war, and it says a very great deal about the age and its odd, half-formed code of honour. Stephen did not storm the castle. He did not sit down and starve it into surrender and take his rival by main force, as he very well might have done, as a harder or a wiser king would surely have done in his place. Instead, after some days of it, he let Matilda go. By the counsel of his own advisers, and moved perhaps by some sense of what was fitting, perhaps by the plain awkwardness of making open war upon a dead king's widow and the great lady of the house, he agreed to grant the Empress a safe conduct out of Arundel, allowing her to depart freely and to be escorted away to the west, to Bristol, where her half-brother Robert of Gloucester held the whole country firmly for her cause. It was, by any cold and sober reckoning of war, a blunder of the first order, and it has been counted against Stephen by historians ever since. For he let the entire war walk quietly out of his hands at the one moment when he had it closed fast within his fist. But it saved Adeliza. The siege was lifted, the Empress went free upon her way, and the Lady of Arundel came through the whole crisis with her castle, her family, and her own life all intact. Why exactly Stephen did it, we cannot wholly say, and the chroniclers themselves seem half puzzled by the thing when they set it down. Some put it down to plain chivalry, to the reluctance of a king to make a prisoner of a great lady, and to press a hard siege against the household of the old king's own widow. Some put it down instead to the counsel of his brother, the powerful bishop Henry of Blois, and of others about him, men who may well have had their own quiet reasons for wishing the war prolonged, rather than ended too soon and too cleanly. Whatever the true cause of it, the effect was to let Adeliza off the very hook on which her own boldness had hung her, and to send the Empress off westward to raise the long war in deadly earnest. For Adeliza herself, the sharp lesson of it must have gone deep. She had reached out a hand to shelter her stepdaughter, and had come within a few days, and a king's passing whim, of losing absolutely everything for it. She had seen with her own eyes how very near the great storm could come to her own quiet door, and she had come through, by good fortune, and by the strange half-mercies of that war, with her house and her people and her family all safe. After the siege was lifted, Adeliza seems to have stepped well back from the great quarrel and given herself once again to her own life and her own family. She had done her one bold and dangerous thing, sheltering the rightful heir at the risk of all she had, and been spared the worst of what might have followed. And thereafter she did not thrust herself forward again into the front of the war. And who alive could blame her for that? She had a husband and a growing family and a large household all to think of and to protect. And the war that now spread its ruin across England was a long, grinding, pitiless thing that brought misery wherever it reached, and no person in their right mind went looking to take a place in the middle of it. So while the kingdom tore at itself, Adeliza held fast to Arundel and to her children, and to her own quieter concerns, on the very edge of the storm, but no longer caught in its centre. Let us look, though only briefly, at that storm. For it was the world she lived out the rest of her English years inside, even as she kept herself and her own clear of its worst. The war between Stephen and Matilda dragged on for close upon 20 years. And the later ages gave all of it a single name that says nearly everything: the Anarchy. It was a war without a clear front or a clean and final decision. A long war of castle against castle and lord against lord, in which the two claimants each held a part of the land, and neither one could ever master all of it. Stephen himself was taken prisoner at one low point in it, and Matilda came within a hair's breadth of being crowned queen at Westminster, only to lose her one chance by some hardness or failure of judgment that turned the people of London against her, and then the wheel of fortune turned once more, and Stephen was freed again, and the whole weary struggle ground on. Meanwhile, the great barons of England, loosed at last from the strong hand that Henry had always kept upon them, did very much as they pleased, raising castles without any leave, making private war upon their neighbours over old grudges, and wringing what they could, by force from the wretched countryside and the people who worked it. The chroniclers of that time wrote of it in words of real and lasting anguish, telling of a broken land in which men said openly to one another that Christ and his saints slept. So unchecked was the cruelty abroad, and so wholly absent now the king's justice that Henry had once made to reach into every corner of every shire. Through all these long troubles, William d'Aubigny held for the most part to King Stephen, whose man he was, and from whom his earldom had come. and he came through the war as a considerable and a respected magnate. Trusted enough that when the fighting was finally done and the old quarrel settled, he passed without ruin into the service of the new king, Matilda's son, and kept his lands and his honour to the end. He was a survivor of that hard time as well as a strong man in it. And Adeliza's household at Arundel rode out the storm under his protection, while so many other houses were broken by it. Whatever the war did to England at large, and it did terrible things, it did not destroy the quiet life that Adeliza had built in the south. And that is no small thing to be able to say of any family in the years of the Anarchy. She and William turned some part of their wealth, as pious lords and ladies did, toward the founding and the enriching of religion. Near Arundel, by the low causeway that carried the road across the marshes of the Arun, they established a small house of canons to keep the way and to pray for their souls. One of those modest foundations that dot the record of the age and mark the passage of a devout and a wealthy couple through the world. Adeliza kept up, besides, her older benefactions, her gifts to Reading where the old king lay, her remembrances of the poor and the sick. The war raged and the land bled, but at Arundel a great lady went on quietly, doing the works that her faith and her station asked of her, endowing prayer, sheltering her people, tending the memory of the dead. It is a picture of a kind of steadiness that the chroniclers, busy with battles and betrayals, seldom pause to draw, but it was the truer shape of most lives, even in that broken time, and it was certainly the shape of hers. It was into this same broken and suffering England that Adeliza's one act of shelter had in its own small way quietly fed, for by letting Matilda slip free and take root in the West, the safe conduct granted at Arundel had helped to make the whole long war possible. She can hardly have wished for such a thing. She had acted most likely out of feeling far more than out of any cold calculation, out of loyalty to the old king's dying wish and kindness to his daughter, and not out of any desire on earth to set the kingdom alight from end to end. But such are the crossing ironies of history, that a single private kindness can carry public consequences that no one ever intended or foresaw. Adeliza's own part in the Great War was one afternoon's brave decision at a castle gate, and then a careful and a deliberate stepping back from it all. The war that she had unwittingly helped along would grind on for 2 full decades and be settled in the very end, long after her own death, and settled not by force of arms at all, but by a weary bargain, when the childless Stephen at last agreed to leave the crown, after his own death, to Matilda's grown son, the young Henry, who would in time become the second King Henry and one of the mightiest kings that England ever knew. But all of that lay well beyond Adeliza's own story. Her own road was turning now, gently, toward its close, and it turned, at the very last, back the way that it had first come, toward the low country of her birth. For all the rich fullness of her English life, Adeliza never wholly ceased to be a daughter of Brabant, and as her years drew on toward their evening, something turned her thoughts back at last toward the watered country where she had first been born. She had left it a girl of 17 or 18, sent across the sea to a marriage of state that she had no hand in making, and she had lived out the whole of her grown life in England. First as its queen, and then as a countess, more than 30 years among a people that were not her own. But the ties of blood and of the first country are not so easily cut through. Her own family still held their lands and their high dignities away in Brabant, her brother ruling there now in their father's place. And there was besides, in that homeland, an abbey to which her house had long been bound in faith and in patronage. The Abbey of Affligem, in the green land between Brussels and Ghent. And in the last part of her life, at some point around 1150, Adeliza left England and went home to end her days in the land where they had first begun. She went, just as she had once gone to Wilton in her early widowhood, into the quiet shelter of religion itself, lodging at Affligham among its monks and its prayers, in the manner of a great lady withdrawing at last from the world to make herself ready for its end. Why exactly she went just then, and whether her husband William was still living when she made the long journey, the thin records leave a little uncertain, and here, as so often in her story, we must be content with what little we can see and honest about the much that we cannot. But the broad shape of it is clear enough, and it is a deeply fitting one. The woman who had been carried out of Brabant as a girl to serve the policy of her father's house came home to Brabant at the last as an aging lady to serve only her own soul, closing the long circle of her life in the very country where it had opened. After all the courts and the castles and the fearful sea crossings, after the crown and the empty cradle and the royal siege at her gate, she came home again, to the flat green land and the slow brown rivers and the familiar speech of her far childhood, to lay her long burdens down at the last. The Abbey of Affligham to which she withdrew was no stranger to her house, and that is likely why she chose it. It was a Benedictine monastery of some fame in the country between Brussels and Ghent, founded shortly before her own birth, and the dukes of her family, the lords of Louvain and Brabant, had been among its friends and its benefactors from its early days. To retire there was to come home, not only to her country, but to a house bound up with her own kin, a place where her family's name was honoured and her family's dead were prayed for, where she was not a stranger seeking shelter, but a daughter of the founder's line, coming to rest among her own. There is a deep fitness in that the woman who had spent her life within the halls of others should end it at last with her own kin, who had helped to raise it. We can imagine the shape of her days there, in the last of her life, and they would have been quiet ones. The great labours were behind her now, the crown laid down long since, the children grown, the dangers survived. What remained was the round of prayer and the making ready that a devout soul of that age turned to at the end. The tending of the spirit for its last journey. She had crossed the sea as a girl to serve a king she had never met, and served him well and long. She had chosen her own second life and been happy in it. And now, an aging woman in a Flemish cloister, she gave her last years to God and to the memory of all that had gone before in the country of her birth, amid the prayers of a house her fathers had loved. Few lives of that age, and fewer lives of its women, come round so gently to their close. Adeliza's did, and we may be glad of it, for her. There is a great gentleness in that ending, and a great rightness to it. So very many of the high-born women of that age died far from where they had been born, planted like cut slips in foreign soil for the sake of alliances that they had never been asked to agree to, and never saw their own homeland again in life. Adeliza was spared that particular sorrow. Whatever else her long years had held of duty and of disappointment, she was granted, at the close of it, the one thing that so many of her sisters in that world were denied: a return to the beginning, a true going home. Picture the aging woman now in the deep quiet of the abbey at Affligham, the round of the monks' prayers rising about her as the round of the nuns' prayers had once risen about her at Wilton in her young widowhood. The low country lying outside the walls just exactly as she had left it as a girl. The same wide pale northern sky, the same patient standing water in the dikes. She had come a very long way, from that flat country to a throne, and all the way back again, and now she was home, and near the end, and at peace with it. She died at Affligham, or thereabouts, in 1151, having lived some 48 years, which was a fair enough span for that hard age, longer than her first husband, the king had granted to many who crossed him, and shorter than the full old age that a fortunate few reached. Where exactly her body was laid to its rest is one of the small uncertainties that cling to her, as they cling to so many of the women of her time, for the records differ among themselves. And you will find it said that she was buried at Affligem, where she died, and said also that her bones were carried back across the sea to England, to Reading, to lie once more near the old King Henry, whose queen she had been, and whose memory she had so faithfully honoured through all her widowed years. We cannot now be certain which of the two is true, and perhaps, in the end, it does not greatly matter which. Either she rests in the homeland that she returned to at the last, or she rests beside the husband of her far youth in the great abbey that he built. And there is a kind of fitness to be found in either resting place. What is certain is only that her long and various and remarkable life came quietly to its close in a cloister among prayers. In the good fullness of her years, history has not made a good deal of noise about Adeliza of Louvain, and there is a reason for that, and it is worth naming. She lived in an age crowded with louder figures, and she stood always a little in the shadow of two other women who both bore the name Matilda, the good first queen whose place she took, and the fierce empress whose long war filled the chronicles, beside a woman fighting for a crown, a woman who kept a quiet house and loved her books and bore her children, makes a smaller mark on the page. The chroniclers of her day, men like William of Malmesbury and Henry of Huntingdon and Orderic Vitalis, noted her, and noted her kindly, but they were busy with battles and betrayals and the fates of kingdoms, and a peaceable queen gave them little to seize upon. And the records of women in that age are thin at the best of times, so that much of her inner life is simply gone, past all recovering. And yet, when you gather up what does remain, a real and an appealing figure stands out of the fragments. A woman of steadiness, who did every hard thing that was asked of her without complaint and kept her fair name through all of it. A lady of cultivation who loved the written word and spent her patronage on it in an age when few of her rank did. A soul capable of one bold act of courage when the moment came, opening her gate to the hunted heir at the risk of everything, and a queen who, given at last the freedom to choose, chose love and life and made a good and a fruitful thing of it. She is remembered, when she is remembered, as the fair maid of Brabant, the queen between the Matildas, a gentle figure at the edge of a violent story. But she deserves, I think, to be remembered a little more fully than that, as a whole person who lived a whole and a remarkable life, and that is what we have tried to do for her tonight, to bring her out of the shadow of the louder ones and let her stand in her own light for an evening. Let us gather up, before we let her go at last into her rest, the whole of what she had been. For hers is a remarkable story when you set it all out end to end. She was born the daughter of a rising count in the cloth country of Brabant, and grew up fully expecting to be spent, one day, upon some alliance of her father's making. The wreck of a ship that she never saw, off a shore she had never once visited, lifted her instead clean onto the throne of England, and she came across the sea, a young girl, to marry an old and formidable king, and to be crowned and anointed his queen before all the realm. For 14 years she was his wife, cultivated and dutiful, a true friend to books and to the poets who made them. And she bore all the while the long private sorrow of a childlessness that was never once her own fault, but was always laid none the less to her charge. Widowed while still young, she withdrew for a season into the quiet of a nunnery, and then did the rarest thing that a woman of her rank could do in that world. She married again for her own heart's sake, to a lesser man who rose high on the strength of the match, and found in that second marriage the house full of children and the settled happiness that the first had never given her. From the peace of her castle at Arundel, she reached out one bold and dangerous hand to shelter the rightful heir of the kingdom, and stood a royal siege for the doing of it, and came through it whole. And at the very last she went home again, across the sea, to the country of her birth, and died at peace among the prayers of an abbey, having been a girl of Brabant, a queen of England, a countess, a mother of many, and a lasting friend to the written word, across nearly 50 full and turning years. Before we say our good night to one another, one last quiet thing, and then I will leave you to your well-earned rest. If the hours we have just spent in the unbroken company of one woman's long life have brought you some ease, and you would like more nights built the same patient way, then you are most welcome to follow along and to subscribe, so that more of them can reach you when sleep is slow in coming, drawing a single figure up out of the far past and walking through her days in order, from the first to the last, is the whole of what I do here. And there is nothing at all you need to do about it now. Only, if this is the sort of company that suits you, then keep it near, in your own unhurried time. That is all of it, and it is more than enough. We have spent these few hours together now in the company of a woman who lived 800 years ago and more, who crossed the sea as a young girl and came home to it again as an old woman, who wore a crown and stood a siege and loved her books and her children, and who has been, I hope, good and gentle company for the falling of the dark. She is many centuries gone now, Adeliza of Louvain, the fair maid of Brabant, the queen who bore no heir, and the countess who bore so many, and yet here she has been with us again, for a little while, held up against the long tide of forgetting by nothing more than the quiet telling of her story. Let her rest now, and let yourself rest along with her. The day is over and done, and there is nothing left in it that you still need to carry. Sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.